Tonight, we're going to explore voices that history often forgets, not the voices of kings or knights, not the proclamations of lords or the commands of generals, but something quieter and perhaps more enduring. The voices of those who sang. We'll journey through the lives of performers and entertainers in Westeros. From a baker's boy who hummed while kneading dough to a court musician whose beautiful voice led him to a terrible end. We'll discover how songs outlast swords, how music moves through the world like water finding its course, and how the people who make that music survive or don't in a realm that values steel more than strings. This won't be a tale of dramatic rises and tragic falls, though there are certainly both. Instead, we'll move slowly through the taverns and great halls, the common rooms and courtyards where music lived and breathed, examining the human stories behind the songs we think we know. If you enjoy these calm explorations of the overlooked corners of Westeros, a like and subscribe really helps others find these peaceful journeys. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let's begin our drift through the world of Westerosi song. Before we can understand the individual singers who move through Westeros, we should perhaps spend some time understanding the world in which they lived and worked. Music in Westeros was not a luxury confined to noble halls, though certainly the great houses valued it. It was everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that are easy to overlook when we focus on the grand political narratives and the clashing of armies. It was in the taverns where travellers sought warmth and ale, in the septs where the faithful gathered to worship, in the castle yards where servants worked, in the camps where soldiers tried to forget tomorrow's battle. Music was how news travelled before ravens could reach every village, how history was preserved when most people couldn't read, how communities came together to celebrate or mourn, how individuals processed joy and grief and everything between. The people who made this music came in many forms, and the distinctions between them were sometimes clear and sometimes blurred depending on circumstance and need. There were singers, of course, those who carried songs from place to place, who knew dozens or hundreds of verses, who could perform for a lord in his hall one night, and for farmers in a common room the next. There were minstrels, a term that often meant much the same thing, though perhaps with slightly more formal training, or more regular patronage from a noble house. There were bards, though this was becoming an old-fashioned word by the time of our story, one that carried echoes of the Age of Heroes and suggested someone who not only sang but composed, who created new songs rather than just performing old ones. There were jongleurs who combined music with other entertainments, juggling or tumbling or performing with trained animals, making their living through variety rather than virtuosity. And there were fools, jesters, professional comedians who might sing bawdy songs or perform comic routines, whose role was as much to amuse through personality as through musical skill. These categories were not rigid. A talented singer might juggle if the audience wanted it. A fool might have a beautiful voice. A minstrel fallen on hard times might perform in circumstances he once would have considered beneath him. The life of a performer required adaptability, the ability to read a room and give people what they wanted, or at least what they would pay for. It required a certain kind of intelligence that had nothing to do with book learning, an understanding of human nature and social dynamics that could mean the difference between a full purse and an empty belly, or in more dangerous times between survival and a swift death for singing the wrong song to the wrong audience. Where did music happen in Westeros? The answer is almost everywhere, but some places were more important than others, more central to the musical life of the realm. The great castles and keeps of noble houses often maintained their own musicians, singers who lived in the castle, who performed at feasts and important occasions, who were part of the household in the same way that the master-at-arms or the steward were part of the household. These were the most fortunate of musicians in many ways, with regular meals and a warm place to sleep, with the prestige of association with a great house. But they were also the most constrained, dependent on a single patron whose favour could be withdrawn, whose political fortunes could rise or fall and take the singer with them. A court musician's life was comfortable but precarious, built on the shifting sands of noble politics. Then there were the taverns and inns, the crossroads of the travelling world, where wandering singers could always find an audience, if not always payment. The innkeeper might offer a meal and a bed in exchange for entertainment, drawing customers who wanted music with their ale. Or the singer might work for whatever coins the patrons chose to throw. A precarious existence where a good night might bring enough silver to live well for a week, and a bad night might bring barely enough copper for a loaf of bread. The great inns along the major roads, the ones that served lords and merchants and travellers with full purses, were the best venues for wandering performers. But even the smallest village might have an alehouse where a singer could perform, though the compensation would be correspondingly meagre. Music also lived in the septs, those seven-sided buildings where the faithful gathered to worship the seven who are one. The septons and septors led their congregations in hymns, songs of devotion that had been sung for thousands of years, their melodies as ancient as the faith itself. These were different from secular entertainment, sacred rather than profane, but they were still music, still required skill to perform well, still moved people in ways that words alone could not. Some septons had beautiful voices and took pride in their musical leadership of worship. Others sang adequately or poorly, but did so anyway because the faithful expected it, because the rituals required it. In the north, where the old gods were still worshipped in godswoods before heart trees, there was less formal music, but even there people sang, their songs perhaps older and stranger than those of the south. Carrying echoes of the first men and the age of heroes, festivals and tournaments brought music out into the open air, into spaces where hundreds or thousands might gather. These were occasions when performers could earn good money if they were skilled or lucky, when the high-born and the common folk mixed together in rare proximity, when there was an appetite for entertainment of all kinds. Jugglers and acrobats performed alongside singers, puppet shows competed with mystery plays, and the air filled with music and laughter and the sounds of celebration. For a wandering performer, a major tournament was like a gift from the gods, an opportunity to perform for lords and ladies who might offer patronage, to network with other performers, to make enough money to live comfortably for months. But music also happened in quieter, more private spaces. Mothers sang to their children, lullabies as old as memory. Servants sang while they worked, the rhythm of their songs matching the rhythm of their labour, making the time pass more quickly. Soldiers sang around their campfires, bawdy songs and marching songs and songs of home, building the camaraderie that might keep them alive in tomorrow's battle. Young lovers sang to each other, or tried to, their voices perhaps not beautiful but filled with feeling. Old men and women sang the songs of their youth, remembering when the world was different, when they were different. Music was woven into life at every level, and while we remember the great singers who performed for kings, there were thousands of ordinary people who sang every day, and whose names no history will ever record. The economic reality of being a performer in Westeros was almost always precarious, unless one secured a position with a wealthy noble house. Even then, security was relative. A lord's favourite singer might live well, but if the lord died or fell from power, that security could vanish overnight. For wandering performers, life was a constant scramble, a perpetual negotiation between the desire for freedom and the need for survival. The roads of Westeros were dangerous even in the best of times, and these were rarely the best of times. Bandits, wild animals, exposure to the elements, starvation, disease, all of these were real threats. And during the War of the Five Kings, when armies marched back and forth across the realm, when the countryside was devastated and normal commerce broke down, the life of a travelling singer became almost impossibly difficult. Payment for performances varied enormously depending on the venue, the audience, and the performer's skill and reputation. A talented singer performing at a noble wedding might receive gold dragons, enough to live comfortably for months or even a year. That same singer performing in a village tavern might receive a handful of copper pennies and a meal. Some performers worked primarily for patronage. forming relationships with wealthy lords who would provide regular support in exchange for availability to perform when needed. This was more stable than working performance to performance, but it required maintaining the patron's favour, navigating court politics, being available when summoned even if one had other plans. Other performers preferred independence despite its hardships, the freedom to travel where they wished, to sing what they wanted, to stay or leave as they chose. Regional differences in musical traditions were significant, reflecting the cultural diversity of the Seven Kingdoms despite their political unification. In the north, the music tended to be starker, more sombre, with themes of winter and survival, and the harshness of the land. The songs often invoked the old gods and ancient heroes, and there was less emphasis on courtly love and chivalric romance than in the south. Northern songs could be beautiful, but it was a spare, austere beauty, much like the land itself. The instruments common in the north reflected this aesthetic as well, simpler and more robust than the delicate harps favoured in the southern courts. In the Riverlands and the Reach, in the Stormlands and the Westerlands, the musical traditions were richer in variety, more influenced by the faith of the Seven and by the ideals of knighthood and chivalry. These were the lands where songs of courtly love flourished, where tragic romances and brave knights and beautiful maidens populated the lyrics. The songs could be sweet or melancholy, rousing or contemplative, but they tended toward a certain romantic sensibility that the North largely lacked. The harps and lutes and other stringed instruments created a sound that was more complex, more ornate, suitable for the elaborate courts where they were most often performed. In Dawn, the music was different again, influenced by the Rhoynish heritage that set the Dornish apart from the rest of Westeros. The rhythms were more complex, the melodies more exotic to northern ears. Drums and percussion played a larger role, and the songs often celebrated themes that would scandalise more proper Westerosi, singing frankly of passion and pleasure, of vengeance and pride, of the sun and the sand and the distinctive character of Dornish culture. The Dornish were proud of their difference, and their music reflected that pride. In the Iron Islands, music existed but was less central to the culture than in most of the realm. The Ironborn valued strength and prowess at arms, the ability to take what was needed rather than to create or perform. Still, they had their songs, often celebrating legendary reavers and great battles, singing of the sea and the drowned god, of ships and storms and the old way of life. The music was harsh and direct, much like the people themselves. Gender played a complicated role in the world of Westerosi performers. Most of the singers we hear about in the histories were men, but this doesn't mean women didn't sing. They certainly did, though often in different contexts and for different audiences. Noble women were expected to have some musical training as part of their education, to be able to sing prettily and play an instrument, particularly the harp. This was part of being an accomplished lady. A social grace like embroidery or dancing. But for a noblewoman to perform professionally, to sing for money or travel as a wandering minstrel, would have been scandalous, unthinkable in most of the Seven Kingdoms. The exceptions existed, particularly in Dawn, where women had more freedom and equality, but they were rare. Common women sang, of course, though rarely as professional performers in the way that men did. They sang while working, in groups with other women, teaching their children songs, participating in religious ceremonies. Some innkeepers' daughters might sing for their father's customers, and this was acceptable as long as it happened within the bounds of the family business, as long as it didn't involve travelling or performing in circumstances that might be considered improper. The double standard was significant and limiting, closing off the professional performance world to half the population, ensuring that many beautiful voices were never heard beyond a small circle of family and friends. The relationship between performers and the people they entertained was complex and variable. Some lords genuinely appreciated music and musicians, collected talented performers the way others collected rare books or fine weapons, treated them with respect and even affection. Other lords saw performers as servants, as interchangeable entertainers whose individual personhood mattered less than their ability to provide amusement when required. And there were surely lords who barely noticed the musicians at all, for whom background music at a feast was just part of the expected atmosphere, as unremarkable as the tapestries on the walls. Common people's relationships with performers were different, perhaps more genuine in some ways. When a wandering singer came to a small village, it was an event, a break in the routine, a source of news and entertainment and connection to the wider world. The singer brought songs from far away, stories of great lords and distant lands, a glimpse of a larger life than most villagers would ever experience. There might be real affection for a singer who visited regularly, a sense of personal connection, or there might be suspicion, wariness of outsiders, reluctance to part with hard-earned coins for something as intangible as a song. Much depended on the singer's skill at reading the audience, at finding the right songs and the right tone for the particular crowd. What united all these performers, from the most privileged court musician to the poorest wandering jongleur, was a fundamental vulnerability. They depended on other people's pleasure for their survival. They had to please, had to perform, had to maintain favour or find new audiences. They had no castles to retreat to, no armies to protect them, no trade goods to fall back on if music failed. Their instrument was their voice or their skill with an instrument, and if that failed them through age or injury or simple bad luck, they had nothing. The marginality of the performer's position in society, the precariousness of their existence, shaped everything about how they lived and worked and survived in a world that could be casually cruel to those without power or protection. And yet, for all this precariousness, for all the vulnerability and hardship, people still chose this life. They chose it because they loved music, because they had talent and wanted to use it, because the freedom of the road called to them more strongly than the security of staying in one place. They chose it because it was better than the alternatives available to them, because a life of performance was still a life, was still worth living, was still full of moments of beauty and connection and meaning. They chose it because songs mattered, because music moved people in ways that nothing else could, because there was a kind of immortality in a well-crafted song that would outlive its creator, carrying something of their spirit forward into a future they would never see. As we move forward through the specific stories of individual singers and performers, it's worth keeping this larger context in mind, this understanding of the world in which they lived and worked. Their choices make more sense when we understand the limited options available to them. Their courage becomes clearer when we appreciate the dangers they faced. Their achievements seem more remarkable when we recognize how easy it would have been to fail, to be forgotten, to leave nothing behind but a few half-remembered songs that would eventually fade into silence like everything else. Among all the performers who made their living through music in Westeros, perhaps none occupied a more complex position than those who served in the courts of the great houses. These were the singers who had achieved what many wandering performers dreamed of, a secure position with regular meals and warm quarters, protection from the elements and from the dangers of the road. The prestige of association with noble power. They performed for lords and ladies, for visiting dignitaries, for the higher circles of Westerosi society. They wore fine clothes provided by their patrons, and slept in castle chambers rather than in common rooms or under hedges. By most measures they had succeeded in their profession, had risen as high as a musician could reasonably hope to rise in a feudal society that valued birth above talent, and yet this apparent success came with dangers that a wandering singer, for all his hardships, might never face. The court musician lived in proximity to power, and power in Westeros was always dangerous, always shifting, always ready to consume those who miscalculated or simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The very qualities that made a court position desirable, the close relationship with noble patrons, the intimate knowledge of household affairs, the access to private moments and conversations, these same qualities could transform a musician from entertainer to liability, from valued servant to dangerous witness who knew too much. the singer had to navigate an environment where every word mattered, where loyalties were tested constantly, where political intrigue could turn deadly with shocking suddenness. A wandering performer who sang the wrong song in the wrong tavern might be beaten or driven out of town, certainly. But a court musician who made a serious error in judgment might find himself silenced permanently in ways that were final and terrible. The very comfort and security of the court position was built on a foundation of sand, dependent on maintaining favour, on never crossing certain invisible lines, on understanding the unspoken rules that governed the household and could never quite be fully learned, because they changed with circumstances and moods. Consider the case of Symon Silvertongue, whose very name suggested the gift that defined him. We don't know a great deal about Symon's background, about where he came from, or how he learned his craft, but we know that he possessed a genuinely beautiful voice, the kind of vocal instrument that could move listeners to tears or laughter, that could fill a great hall with sound or create an intimate atmosphere in a smaller chamber. His talent was real, not merely adequate but exceptional, and it had brought him to King's Landing, to the very centre of power in the Seven Kingdoms, where he performed for wealthy patrons and made a living that most singers would envy. Symon composed his own songs, which marked him as more than just a performer of traditional material. He had the creative gift as well as the vocal one, the ability to craft new melodies and lyrics, to create art that was distinctively his own. This was a point of pride, surely, a mark of his status as a serious artist rather than a mere entertainer. And perhaps this pride, this sense of his own talent and worth, contributed to the choice he would eventually make, the choice that would end his life in a manner so brutal that the details are difficult to contemplate even from the safe distance of historical narrative. Symon became aware of Tyrion Lannister's relationship with Shae, the young woman Tyrion had brought to King's Landing and installed in a house, keeping her as a mistress in defiance of his father's explicit commands. This was dangerous knowledge, the kind of information that could destroy Tyrion's already precarious position in his family and in the court. Tyrion had been careful, or tried to be, but secrecy is difficult to maintain in a city like King's Landing, where servants gossip and spies are everywhere, where anyone might be watching or listening or piecing together fragments of information into a complete and damaging picture. How exactly Symon learned of the relationship is unclear. Perhaps he performed at the house where Shae was staying, or perhaps he heard rumours and investigated, or perhaps someone told him, hoping to use him as an instrument against Tyrion. However he learned of it, Symon made a decision that seemed, from his perspective, perhaps rational, or at least understandable. He composed a song about the relationship, a piece that thinly veiled the real identities of the lovers, but that anyone familiar with court gossip would instantly recognise. And then he approached Tyrion with what was essentially a blackmail proposal. He would not perform the song publicly, would not spread this information that could ruin the hand of the king, if Tyrion would use his influence to secure Symon a position performing at the upcoming royal wedding of Joffrey and Margaery. From Symon's point of view, this might have seemed like a reasonable exchange. He had information that was valuable, that Tyrion would surely pay to suppress. He wasn't asking for gold directly, just for help in advancing his career, in securing a prestigious position at one of the most important events in years. Perhaps he thought Tyrion would see this as a minor favour, easily granted, a small price to pay for silence. Perhaps he didn't fully understand who he was dealing with, didn't grasp that Tyrion, for all his physical limitations and his problematic position within his family, was still a Lannister. Still possessed of the Lannister ruthlessness when threatened, still capable of arranging unpleasant solutions to inconvenient problems. Or perhaps Symon understood perfectly well the danger he was courting, and did it anyway, driven by ambition or desperation, or the simple calculation that the risk was worth the potential reward. We cannot know his thoughts, cannot read his mind across the years and through the barrier between fiction and analysis. We can only observe his choice and its consequences and reflect on what they tell us about the world in which he lived and died. Tyrion's response to Symon's blackmail attempt was characteristic of the ruthless practicality that he employed when he felt cornered or threatened. He had Symon killed, and the method was calculated to ensure that the body would never be found. Would never raise questions. Symon was killed and his body was put into a pot of brown, the thick stew that was served to the poor of King's Landing at the communal kitchens. His remains were consumed by hungry commoners who never knew they were eating human flesh, who thought they were receiving charity from the crown. The horror of this fate is difficult to overstate, though we must be careful not to sensationalize it, not to dwell on the physical details in a way that would disturb rather than inform. What matters for our purposes is what Symon's death reveals about the position of court musicians, about the dangers of knowing too much, about the disposability of even talented performers when they came into conflict with real power. Symon had a beautiful voice, genuine talent, ambition that was perhaps not entirely unreasonable, and none of it mattered when he threatened someone with the resources and the will to silence him permanently. We might wonder what Symon thought in his final moments, whether he recognized his error, whether he regretted his attempt at blackmail, whether he understood that his talent would not protect him, that beauty and art were no shield against political violence. But these wonderings are ultimately fruitless. Symon died. His voice was silenced, and the song he had composed about Tyrion and Shae was never performed, at least not in any way that survived in the historical record. He became a cautionary tale, though whether other court musicians heard of his fate and learned from it, we cannot know. The story of Marillion presents a different variation on the theme of the court musician, destroyed by proximity to power. Marillion was also talented. Possessed of a strong voice and skill with the harp and the wood harp, able to perform the complex pieces that lords expected and appreciated. He travelled with Catelyn Stark's party when she arrested Tyrion at the inn at the crossroads, and he continued with them to the Vale of Arryn to the Eyrie where Lysa Arryn ruled as regent for her young son. At the Eyrie, Marillion found a position that seemed secure and even advantageous. Lysa appreciated his talents and paid him well for his performances. He had achieved the court position that so many wandering singers desired, a place in one of the great houses of Westeros, regular work, the respect due to a valued household musician. And yet, Marillion's character had flaws that would ultimately prove fatal, though whether these flaws were inherent in his nature or developed in response to the corrupting environment of Lysa's court is a question we might contemplate without resolving. Marillion attempted to rape Sansa Stark, an act of violence that reveals something dark in his character, a willingness to use his position and the isolation of the Eyrie to prey on someone vulnerable and alone. Sandor Clegane intervened and saved Sansa, but the incident marked Marillion as someone dangerous, someone whose talent did not excuse or compensate for his willingness to harm others, and yet he remained at the Eyrie, continued to perform for Lysa, continued to occupy his position in the household. When Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, came to the Eyrie and murdered Lysa by pushing her through the moon door, the opening in the floor of the high hall that led to a drop of hundreds of feet to the stones below, he needed a scapegoat, someone to blame for the murder. Marillion served this purpose perfectly. Littlefinger and Sansa and the others present testified that Marillion had killed Lysa, that the singer had become obsessed with the Lady of the Vale, and murdered her when she rejected his advances. The story was plausible enough, consistent with what was known of Marillion's character after his attempted assault on Sansa. Marillion was imprisoned in the Sky Cells, those terrible prison chambers at the Eyrie that were open to the air on one side, where prisoners froze at night and lived in constant fear of accidentally rolling or stumbling through the opening to fall to their deaths. He was tortured to extract a confession. Methods applied until he would say whatever his captors wanted him to say. Eventually he confessed to murdering Lysa, and he even sang about it, his voice putting his own guilt into verses that seemed like proof of his crime. The truth of what Marillion knew or believed by the end is impossible to determine. Had he been tortured into genuinely believing he had killed Lisa? His mind breaking under the pressure until false memories seemed real? Or did he know the truth but confess anyway because the pain was unbearable, and confession offered the only hope of making it stop? Or did he confess cynically, knowing he was lying, but calculating that confession might lead to a quicker death and continued resistance? We cannot know, and perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is that Marillion, for all his talent, for all his skill with voice and harp, became a tool used by more powerful people to conceal a murder, his life and his truth sacrificed to political convenience. He died in the sky cells, we must presume, unless he was executed after his confession. Either way, his death was the direct result of his position at court, of his proximity to powerful people who were willing to use him and discard him. A wandering singer might have lived a harder life, might have starved or frozen or been killed by bandits, but he would not have died this particular death, would not have been tortured into confessing to a murder he didn't commit, would not have become a pawn in games he barely understood. The Blue Bard represents yet another variation, another way that court musicians could be destroyed by the very power they served. His real name is not recorded, or at least not widely remembered. He was known as the Blue Bard because he wore blue clothing, and this was apparently distinctive enough to serve as his primary identifier. He was a musician in King's Landing during the period when Cersei Lannister was trying desperately to maintain her power and to destroy her enemies, real and imagined. Cersei needed someone to testify that Marguerite Tyrell had committed adultery, had been unfaithful to her husband King Tommen, had betrayed the crown in the most intimate and damaging way possible. Such testimony would destroy Marguerite, would break the alliance between the Lannisters and the Tyrells, would serve Cersei's purposes even if it also destabilized the realm and created new dangers. But she needed credible witnesses, people who would claim to have been Marguerite's lovers, who would provide the details necessary to make the accusation believable. The Blue Bard was selected for this role, though whether he volunteered or was simply chosen we don't know. He was arrested and tortured by Qyburn, the disgraced maester who served Cersei, and who had no qualms about employing any method, no matter how brutal or unethical, to achieve his aims. The Blue Bard was tortured until he confessed to having sexual relations with Marguerite, until he provided the specific details that Cersei needed, until his voice, that instrument which had been his livelihood and perhaps his pride, was employed in service of a lie that would destroy an innocent woman. The cruelty of this is manifold. The Blue Bard was almost certainly innocent, was likely chosen randomly, or because he was vulnerable, because he had no powerful protectors who would seek vengeance for his treatment, because he was disposable in the eyes of those who wielded power. His torture was not an attempt to discover truth, but to create a useful falsehood, to manufacture evidence for a predetermined conclusion. And his cooperation was extracted through pain so severe that he would say anything, confess to anything, implicate anyone if only the pain would stop. What became of the Blue Bard after his confession is unclear. Perhaps he died under torture. His body pushed too far and breaking under the strain. Perhaps he survived and was imprisoned or executed once his usefulness ended. Perhaps he lived but was broken, his mind or body or spirit so damaged that he was never whole again. The historical record does not tell us, and this silence is itself revealing. He was important enough to be used, but not important enough to be remembered, not significant enough for his ultimate fate to be recorded. These three singers, Symon Silvertongue, Marillion, and the Blue Bard represent different ways that court musicians could be destroyed by power, but there were surely others whose stories are lost or less well documented. We hear of Gallion of Kai, who performed at noble gatherings, and Alaric of Ison, whose name suggests he too found court positions, and various unnamed singers at Winterfell and other great castles. Some of these may have lived long lives and died peacefully in their beds. their talent appreciated and their service rewarded with security and comfort. But we remember the ones who died badly, whose proximity to power proved fatal. And we should perhaps consider why these stories were preserved while happier ones faded. The pattern that emerges from these stories is clear and troubling. Court musicians occupied a position that was simultaneously privileged and vulnerable. They had access to private spaces and conversations that most people never witnessed. They heard things, saw things, knew things, and this knowledge could transform them from valued entertainers into dangerous liabilities who needed to be silenced or controlled. The very intimacy that made them effective performers, their ability to be present but unobtrusive, to fade into the background of a scene while still observing everything, this quality made them dangerous to those who had secrets to keep. Moreover, musicians lacked the protection that other servants might possess. A captain of the guard might have loyal soldiers who would question his disappearance. A steward might have financial records whose sudden absence would be noticed. A maester had the backing of the citadel, an institution that transcended individual houses. But a singer had only his voice and his instrument, and neither could protect him from a determined enemy. He could be killed and replaced, and the songs would continue. Performed by someone else, the audience barely noticing that the performer had changed. The court musician had to develop a kind of political intelligence that went beyond musical skill. He had to know when to perform and when to be silent, what songs were safe and what songs might give offence, whose favour was worth cultivating and whose attention was dangerous to attract. He had to be observant enough to navigate complex court politics, but not so observant that he became a threat. He had to be memorable enough to be valued, but forgettable enough to be safe. It was a nearly impossible balance, and the consequences of miscalculation could be swift and final. And yet people still sought these positions, still aspired to become court musicians despite the dangers. The alternative, the life of a wandering performer, was hard enough that the risks of court life seemed acceptable in comparison. At least at court one was warm and fed. At least there was the possibility of genuine appreciation for one's art, of performing for audiences who understood quality and could distinguish excellence from mere competence. At least there was some hope of being remembered, of leaving a mark, of mattering in some small way in the grand sweep of history. The tragedy is that the court musicians we remember best are those who died badly, whose talents could not save them, whose proximity to power became the instrument of their destruction. Symon's silver tongue in a pot of brown, his beautiful voice silenced and his body consumed by those who never knew what they were eating. Marillion in the sky cells, tortured into confessing to a murder he didn't commit. His skill with the harp meaningless in the face of political necessity. The blue bard broken by Qyburn's tortures. His voice used to speak lies that would destroy others. These are the stories that survived, perhaps because they illustrate something important about power and vulnerability, about art and violence, about the terrible fragility of a life built on talent alone in a world that valued force above all else. If the court musicians we've just discussed occupied one end of the spectrum of musical life in Westeros, bound to place and patron, their fortunes rising and falling with the houses they served, then the wandering singers occupied the other end, unbound and free in ways that were both liberating and terrifying. These were the performers who owned nothing but their instruments and the clothes on their backs, who slept in different places nearly every night, who answered to no lord or lady except when they chose to accept a temporary engagement. Their lives were harder in material terms than those of court musicians, certainly, with less security and comfort, with the constant pressure of not knowing where the next meal would come from, or where they would shelter when winter storms arrived. But they possessed something that court musicians could only dream of, the freedom to leave, to walk away, to move on when a situation became uncomfortable or dangerous or simply dull. The wandering singer lived by his wits and his talent, by his ability to read a room and give an audience what it wanted, by his knowledge of which songs would please farmers in the Riverlands and which would appeal to merchants in White Harbour, by his instinct for when to stay and when to move on before welcome wore thin or danger arrived. He was his own master in a world where most people belonged to someone else. Bound by oaths of fealty or the simple necessities of survival that tied them to a particular place and lord. This independence came at a cost, to be certain, but for those with the temperament for it, the cost seemed worth paying, and they chose the road again and again despite its hardships. Among the wandering singers we encounter in the histories of the War of the Five Kings, perhaps none is more interesting or more complex than the man known as Tom of Sevenstreams, called Tom Sevenstrings for his skill with the harp. Tom's life illustrates the complicated relationship between music and survival, between art and pragmatism, between the image of the carefree minstrel and the reality of someone who had lived hard and learned to adapt to circumstances that would have broken a less resilient person. Tom of Sevenstreams was not born to music, or at least he had not always been a singer in the way that we might imagine when we picture a dedicated artist who lives for his craft. In his youth he had been an outlaw, riding with a group called the Kingswood Brotherhood that operated in the forests of the Stormlands and the Crownlands, preying on travellers and evading the king's justice. This was during the reign of Aerys II, the Mad King, and the Kingswood Brotherhood had achieved a certain notoriety, becoming enough of a problem that eventually a force led by notable knights was sent to destroy them. The Brotherhood was broken, its members killed or scattered, and Tom survived by fleeing and eventually reinventing himself as a wandering singer. This transformation from outlaw to minstrel might seem surprising, but perhaps it makes a certain kind of sense when we consider the skills required for both occupations. An outlaw needed to be able to read people and situations, to know when to fight and when to flee, to move through different territories and adapt to changing circumstances. A wandering singer needed many of the same abilities, the same alertness to danger, the same capacity for quick thinking and adaptation. Tom had survived as an outlaw, and he survived as a singer, and the transition between the two roles was perhaps less dramatic than it might appear from the outside. By the time we encounter Tom in the narratives of the war, he had been a singer for many years, long enough to be genuinely skilled at his craft. He could play the harp and the wood harp with real ability, not merely adequately, but well enough to earn his keep in respectable establishments. He knew hundreds of songs, the traditional ballads and drinking songs and marching tunes that made up the common repertoire of Westerosi music. He had a pleasant voice, not remarkable perhaps, not the kind of instrument that would have secured him a position at court, but good enough for taverns and common rooms, good enough to please most audiences he encountered. More importantly, Tom understood people and he understood the world in which he moved. He was practical rather than romantic about his profession, seeing music as a means of survival rather than as some elevated calling. He sang because it fed him, because it kept him warm and dry, because it was better than the alternatives available to a former outlaw who could never entirely escape his past. And yet, there was also genuine pleasure in it, real satisfaction in a song well performed, in an appreciative audience. In the life of movement and variety that wandering provided, Tom was cynical but not bitter, pragmatic but not entirely without idealism, a survivor who had found a way to live that suited his temperament and his circumstances. When the War of the Five Kings began, and the Brotherhood without banners formed under Beric Dondarrion, Tom eventually joined them. Though whether this was a deliberate choice, or simply a case of being in the right place at the right time is unclear. The Brotherhood was an unusual organisation, outlaws of a sort, but with a mission that was more principled than mere banditry. They fought for the common people, or claimed to, protecting small folk from the ravages of the various armies that marched back and forth across the Riverlands. They had no loyalty to any particular king or faction, serving instead a more abstract ideal of justice and protection for those who had no other defenders. Tom's role in the Brotherhood was complicated and multifaceted, reflecting both his skills as a singer and his experience as a former outlaw. On the surface, he was the Brotherhood's minstrel, the entertainer who performed for his comrades, who helped maintain morale through music, who sang the old songs that reminded men of home and peace and better times. But he was also a spy and a scout, someone who could move through the war-torn countryside with relative freedom because singers were expected to wander, because a man with a harp was less threatening than a man with a sword, because music provided cover for gathering information and making contacts and moving between different armies and factions. Tom would perform in taverns and camps, in castles and farmhouses, singing the songs that audiences requested, accepting whatever payment was offered, seeming like just another wandering minstrel trying to survive the chaos of war. But while he sang, he listened, paying attention to conversations around him, to the gossip and news and casual remarks that might contain valuable intelligence. He noted troop movements and supply situations, learned which lords were loyal to which kings, discovered where valuables might be stored or where defences were weak, and then he would return to the Brotherhood and share what he had learned. His music having served as the cover for espionage that helped the outlaws survive and pursue their mission. This double life required considerable skill and nerve. Tom had to be convincing as a singer, had to genuinely perform well enough that no one suspected him of ulterior motives. He had to remember which songs he had sung where, which stories he had told to which audiences, maintaining a consistent persona across multiple encounters with different groups. He had to know when to ask questions and when to simply listen, when to show interest in military matters, and when to seem focused only on music and payment. One slip, one moment of seeming too interested in the wrong information, and he might have been exposed as a spy with consequences that would have been swift and final. The songs Tom sang were mostly traditional pieces, the common stock of Westerosi music that every wandering singer knew and every audience expected. Quote Zero was one of his favourites, a bawdy comic song about a bear who dances with a maiden, full of sexual innuendo and rousing choruses that encouraged audience participation. It was the kind of song that worked well in taverns and camps, that loosened tongues and created a convivial atmosphere, that made Tom seem harmless and entertaining rather than dangerous. Quote One was another, similarly comic and slightly scandalous, the kind of material that soldiers and common folk appreciated. But Tom also knew more serious songs, ballads of ancient heroes and tragic lovers, songs of war and peace and the turning of the seasons. He could perform courtly pieces if the audience warranted it, though these were less common in the circumstances where he usually found himself. He could sing religious hymns if asked, though given his outlaw past and his current activities. There might have been a certain irony in performing songs of devotion and righteousness. The breadth of his repertoire was itself a survival skill, allowing him to adapt to different audiences and situations, to provide whatever kind of entertainment was wanted or needed. The relationship between Tom and the other members of the Brotherhood was complex and apparently genuine. He was not merely using them for his own purposes, not simply exploiting the organisation as cover for his wandering. He seemed to believe in what the Brotherhood was trying to do, to share their concern for the common people who suffered most in the wars of lords and kings. He fought when fighting was necessary, though his primary value was as a scout and spy rather than as a warrior. He contributed to the group's survival and success, and they in turn provided him with companions and purpose, with something larger than mere individual survival to be part of. When the Brotherhood encountered Arya Stark travelling under a false name, Tom was part of the group that captured her and her companions. He performed his role as genial singer, entertaining the captives, seeming friendly and harmless while the Brotherhood decided what to do with these unexpected prisoners. Later, when Arya was travelling with the Brotherhood, Tom was a familiar presence, someone she came to know through the daily routines of the outlaw group's life. His music was part of the soundtrack of that period of her life, the songs he sang becoming associated with the complex mix of danger and companionship, of violence and unexpected kindness that characterized the Brotherhood without banners. Tom of Sevenstreams represents one particular type of wandering singer, someone who used music instrumentally as a means to other ends, while still apparently taking genuine pleasure in the performance itself. But there were many other wandering singers moving through Westeros during this period, each with their own stories and circumstances, each finding their own ways to survive in a world that had become far more dangerous than it had been in peacetime. Some singers travelled circuits, regular routes that took them through the same towns and villages at roughly the same times each year. These performers built relationships with their audiences, becoming familiar figures who were anticipated and welcomed, whose arrival marked the changing of the seasons as surely as the first frost or the first spring flowers. An innkeeper might know that a particular singer would arrive during the harvest season and would plan special events or festivals around the performance, drawing customers who wanted to hear the news and songs from other parts of the realm. A village might look forward to the annual visit from a singer who had performed for their parents and grandparents, who carried on traditions and preserved songs that might otherwise be lost. Other singers wandered more randomly, following opportunities or fleeing dangers, moving without fixed patterns or destinations. These were often younger performers, or those who had failed to establish regular circuits. People still searching for their place in the musical landscape of Westeros. They might have more freedom in some ways, being less predictable and thus perhaps harder for enemies or dangers to track, but they also had less security, lacking the semi-regular income and the established relationships that circuit performers could rely on. The practical realities of the wandering life were considerable and constant. A singer needed to maintain his instrument, which could be difficult when travelling through rough weather and sleeping in barns or under hedges. Harps and lutes were delicate, sensitive to temperature and humidity, prone to damage from impacts or careless handling. Strings broke and needed to be replaced. Wood could crack or warp, and a damaged instrument meant no income until repairs could be made. Some singers learned to do their own repairs, carrying spare strings and basic tools, becoming as skilled at instrument maintenance as at performance. Others had to seek out craftsmen in larger towns, paying for repairs that might consume weeks or months of earnings. Food and shelter were perpetual concerns. In good times, in prosperous regions not touched by war, a singer could usually earn enough to eat reasonably well and to pay for lodging in taverns or common rooms. The arrangement was often informal, a performance in exchange for a meal and a place by the fire. Perhaps a few copper coins if the audience was generous or the performance particularly good. But in wartime, when armies had stripped the countryside of food and money, when travel was dangerous and people were suspicious of strangers, earning enough to survive became much harder. Singers went hungry, slept cold, walked past burned-out villages that had once been stops on their circuits, found that patrons who had been generous in peacetime now had nothing to give. The dangers of the road were both ordinary and extraordinary. There were the common hazards that any traveller faced: wild animals and difficult terrain, rivers in flood and mountain passes choked with snow, simple accidents that could leave someone injured far from help. There were bandits who might rob a traveller. Though a singer with nothing but an instrument and worn clothing was not the most attractive target. There was disease, always present but more dangerous when one was poorly fed and exhausted, when wounds festered because there was no maester to treat them, when winter coughs became lung fevers that killed. But during the War of the Five Kings there were additional dangers specific to the conflict. Armies on the march might conscript any able-bodied man they encountered, and a singer's protest that he was a performer, not a fighter, might fall on deaf ears or might simply be ignored. Soldiers might steal from travellers, taking anything of value including musical instruments, leaving the singer with no means to earn a living. War bands might kill travellers out of general principle or mistaken identity or simple cruelty. The breakdown of normal social order meant that the minimal protections that travellers usually enjoyed, the custom of hospitality and the general prohibition against murdering harmless wanderers, could no longer be relied upon. And yet, despite all these hardships and dangers, the wandering singers continued to wander. They moved through the war-torn landscape, carrying their songs and their instruments, performing in whatever venues they could find for whatever audiences remained. They adapted to circumstances as Tom of Sevenstreams had done, finding ways to make themselves useful or at least harmless, learning which songs to sing and which to avoid, developing the survival skills that meant the difference between making it through to another day and becoming another uncounted casualty of the war. The freedom of the road, that independence that was the wandering singer's greatest asset, remained valuable even when the road became far more dangerous than it had been. A court musician trapped in a castle under siege had no options but to endure whatever came. A wandering singer could leave, could move to a different region, could change direction when he learned of dangers ahead. This mobility was itself a kind of power, limited but real. The power to choose one's own path even when all the paths were difficult. Some wandering singers used their mobility to carry messages, becoming informal messengers in a world where communication had broken down. They might carry letters for a small fee, or convey verbal messages from one town to another, or simply spread news through their performances, singing songs that contained information about recent events or current conditions. This was dangerous work, as messengers could be intercepted and killed by any faction that opposed the messages they carried. But it was also valuable work that people would pay for when official means of communication had failed. The songs themselves became weapons in a different sense during the war. A singer performing in a Lannister camp might sing songs that praised the Lannisters and mocked their enemies, building morale among the troops and perhaps earning better payment from commanders who appreciated the propaganda value. That same singer, moving to a different region controlled by different forces, might sing entirely different songs, praising different leaders and condemning different enemies. This adaptability could be seen as cynical opportunism, performing whatever pleased the audience regardless of truth or personal belief, but it could also be seen as simple survival, as a recognition that songs were entertainment, and that entertainers who refused to please their audiences soon found themselves without audiences or income. There was an honesty to the wandering life, a directness that court positions lacked. A wandering singer who performed poorly or chose inappropriate songs would know immediately, through the silence or hostility of the audience, through the lack of payment, or the suggestion that he should move along. There was no complex court politics to navigate, no hidden rules about what could and couldn't be sung. If the audience liked the performance, they showed it. If they didn't, they showed that too. This immediate feedback could be harsh, but it was also clean, transparent in a way that court relationships rarely were. The companionship of the road was transient, could be genuine. Singers might travel together for a time, sharing the journey and the performances, pooling resources and providing mutual protection. These partnerships might last for weeks or months before the singers went their separate ways, following different opportunities or simply feeling the need for solitude or change. There was a community of wandering performers who knew each other by reputation, if not personally, who might meet at festivals or market days, who shared information about good venues and dangerous territories, who helped each other in the informal ways that people on the margins of society often do. As we move forward in our exploration of singers and performers in Westeros, we'll encounter others who found different accommodations with their circumstances, who chose different paths, or had different paths chosen for them. But the wandering singers, with their freedom and their vulnerability, their adaptability and their persistence, represent something essential about the musical life of this world. Something that persists despite war and hardship and all the forces that might seem likely to silence them. They kept singing, kept moving, kept finding audiences and reasons to perform, and in doing so they kept alive something that was more than mere entertainment, something about human resilience and the stubborn refusal to let the world's darkness extinguish all light and beauty. While Tom of Sevenstreams and the wandering singers we've just discussed chose to continue their musical lives despite all the hardships and dangers, moving through the world with their instruments and their repertoires, adapting, but not fundamentally changing their relationship to performance, there were others who made different choices, who set down their harps or stopped singing. who found other ways to survive when music became too dangerous or simply too difficult. These decisions to stop performing, to transform from singer to something else, carry their own kind of wisdom, their own recognition of reality and limitation that deserves our attention and perhaps our respect. The question of what makes someone a performer in the first place is worth contemplating before we can fully understand what it means to stop being one. Is it professional designation? The fact that one earns one's living through music? Is it talent, the possession of a beautiful voice or skill with an instrument? Is it dedication, the choice to centre one's life around the creation and performance of music? Or is it something simpler and more fundamental, the act of singing itself, regardless of skill or compensation or social recognition? These definitions matter because they shape how we understand the stories of those who stopped performing, whether we see them as failures who gave up or as survivors who adapted, as people who lost something essential or as people who found something more important. Consider the case of Hot Pie, whose very name tells us that he was never primarily a performer, that his identity was always more baker than singer, more concerned with the practical work of feeding people than with the more ethereal work of entertaining them. Hot Pie was a baker's boy in King's Landing, one of the countless apprentices and servants who formed the invisible foundation of the city's daily life, learning a trade that would presumably support him throughout his life. He was not born to nobility or to any particular privilege, but neither was he among the most desperate of the city's poor. He had a place, a role, the reasonable expectation of eventually becoming a baker himself, perhaps running his own shop if fortune favoured him. When we first encounter Hot Pie in the narratives, he's being taken north with a group of recruits for the night's watch, boys and men rounded up from King's Landing streets and prisons. Some volunteers, but many essentially pressed into service, shipped off to the wall to fill out the watch's dwindling ranks. Hot Pie was not a criminal, not someone who deserved this fate, but in the chaos following Robert Baratheon's death and the outbreak of war, such distinctions mattered little. He was young and able-bodied, and that was enough reason to conscript him, to tear him away from his apprenticeship and send him north to a life he had never chosen and did not want. The journey north was terrible, though we should be careful not to dwell on the worst details in a way that would disturb rather than inform. The group was treated harshly by their guards, given inadequate food and forced to march in all weather, punished severely for any resistance or complaint. Hot Pie was terrified, reasonably so, a boy removed from everything familiar and thrust into circumstances he could not control or even fully understand. And yet, even in this terror and misery, there was something in Hot Pie that reached for normalcy, for the simple human activities that make life bearable even in the worst circumstances. He sang, or at least he made music of a sort. Not professionally, not with any particular skill or training, but in the way that people sing when they work or when they're trying to comfort themselves, or when they simply need to make some kind of sound that isn't a cry of despair. He hummed tunes while he kneaded the dough when he was allowed to help prepare food, the rhythm of the song matching the rhythm of his hands pressing and folding, pressing and folding. He muttered rhymes to himself, simple children's verses that he must have learned in his early years, before apprenticeship, when he was small enough that such things still seemed important and comforting. These were not performances in any meaningful sense. Hot Pie was not trying to entertain anyone, was not seeking payment or recognition, or even really an audience. He was simply doing what humans do, finding small ways to maintain their humanity in dehumanizing circumstances, creating little pockets of normalcy and routine that can be held onto when everything else is being stripped away. The songs and rhymes were threads connecting him to his former life, to the city where he had been someone with a name and a place, to the work he had been learning and had expected to continue. When the group was captured by Lannister men and taken to Harrenhal, the great castle that had once been Harren the Black's monument to his own power and had become a place of suffering and death, Hot Pie's situation went from bad to worse. Harrenhal under the Lannisters, and then under various other factions as control shifted, was not a place where music flourished or where anyone had much energy for singing. It was a place of exhaustion and fear, of backbreaking labour and casual cruelty, where survival itself required all of one's attention and effort. And yet Hot Pie survived, not through any particular heroism or cunning, but through a combination of adaptability and a certain fundamental practicality that was perhaps his greatest strength. He worked in the kitchens when he could, using the skills he had learned as a baker's apprentice, making himself useful in ways that earned him better treatment and more reliable food. He kept his head down, did what he was told, avoided attracting attention from those with the power to hurt or kill him. He made friends with Arya Stark, travelling under the name Arry, and with Gendry, the smith's apprentice, though none of them knew the true identities of the others at first. These friendships were important, providing emotional support and human connection in circumstances where both were rare and precious. Hot Pie was loyal to his friends in his own way, though his loyalty was always tempered by his terror, by his awareness of his own vulnerability and limitations. When choices had to be made between staying with his friends and staying safe, Hot Pie's instinct was almost always towards safety, toward the option that seemed least likely to get him killed. This might be seen as cowardice, and perhaps there is some truth to that interpretation, but it might also be seen as simple realism, as an accurate assessment of his own capabilities and the dangers of the world he found himself in. When the opportunity came to escape Harrenhal, Hot Pie joined Arya and Gendry, fleeing into the countryside in hopes of finding safety, or at least finding somewhere less immediately dangerous than the castle had become. The journey was difficult, travelling through a war-torn landscape where any encounter with other people might prove fatal, where food was scarce and shelter uncertain, where the three children had to rely on each other and on luck to survive. Hot Pie was not particularly good at the skills this journey required. He was not a skilled woodsman or hunter, not particularly brave or strong, not quick-thinking in the way that Arya was, but he kept going, driven by the simple determination to survive, to somehow get through each day and each night and continue existing. And he still sang in his way, still hummed and muttered and found small moments of something that approached contentment even in the midst of hardship. When they managed to cook a meal, Hot Pie took pride in the preparation, in doing the work properly even though the ingredients were poor and the circumstances desperate. He talked about baking, about the work he'd been learning, about the life he'd expected to live before everything fell apart. These conversations were not just nostalgia, though there was certainly an element of longing for a lost past. They were also affirmations of identity, reminders that he was still Hot Pie, the baker's apprentice, still the person he had been, even though circumstances had changed so dramatically. The crucial moment in Hot Pie's story, the point at which he made the decision that would define the rest of his life, came when the three fugitives encountered an inn, a place called the Inn at the Crossroads, that had been damaged in the war, but was being reopened by a woman who had somehow survived the various armies and bandits that had swept through the region. The innkeeper needed help, needed workers to repair the building and to serve what few travellers still moved along the roads. She offered Hot Pie a position, safety and shelter, and regular meals in exchange for his labour in her kitchens. Hot Pie accepted, and in accepting, he chose to end his journey with Arya and Gendry, chose to stop moving, and to instead put down roots in a place that seemed safe enough, secure enough, worth the risk of staying. Arya and Gendry continued their journey, continuing to search for something they could not quite name, driven by purposes and destinies that Hot Pie did not share. But Hot Pie stayed, and in staying, he transformed from a fugitive into a worker, from a boy running from danger into a young man trying to build something like a normal life. This choice is the heart of Hot Pie's story, and the heart of what we're contemplating in this portion of our exploration. Hot Pie recognised his own limitations, understood that he was not cut out for the life of adventure or danger or constant movement that Arya and Gendry seemed able to endure. He knew that he was terrified most of the time, that he was not particularly brave or skilled, that what he wanted more than anything was simply to be safe, to have enough to eat, to do work that he understood and took pride in. And so he made the choice to stop, to give up the journey and the companionship of his friends in exchange for the possibility of security and normalcy. There is no shame in this choice, though Hot Pie himself seemed to feel some, seemed to recognize that by staying he was admitting weakness or limitation that his friends did not share. But wisdom is knowing oneself, understanding one's own nature and capabilities, making choices that align with who one actually is rather than who one might wish to be or think one should be. Hot Pie knew himself and he chose accordingly, and this self-knowledge is its own kind of strength, even if it does not look impressive or heroic from the outside. At the inn, Hot Pie threw himself into his work with an enthusiasm and dedication that suggested genuine happiness, or at least something approaching contentment. He worked in the kitchens using the skills he had learned in his apprenticeship, creating simple dishes from whatever ingredients were available. And he began to experiment, to try new things, to develop his own small innovations within the limited possibilities of his circumstances. He became particularly proud of his bread, especially his attempts to shape loaves into the forms of animals, creating what he called direwolf bread in honour of Arya and her connection to House Stark, though whether he fully understood the connection is unclear. This bread shaping was a kind of art, a form of creativity and self-expression that was not exactly performance, but that shared some qualities with it. Hot Pie was making something beautiful, or trying to, creating forms that pleased him and that he hoped would please others. He took pride in his work in a way that suggested it meant something to him beyond mere survival, that it engaged some part of his spirit that needed engagement. The direwolf bread was not music, certainly, but it was made with the same fundamental human impulse to create, to make something that did not exist before, to leave some small mark of one's presence in the world. When Brienne of Tarth and Podrick Payne later stopped at the inn, and Hot Pie learned that they were searching for Arya, he gave them information that helped them in their quest, and he sent with them some of his direwolf bread, wanting Arya to know that he remembered her, that he was still her friend even though they had parted ways. The bread was a message, a physical token of connection and memory, serving some of the same functions that a song might serve, carrying meaning beyond its literal substance. Hot Pie's story is important because it represents a particular kind of survival, a particular set of choices that are different from those made by the wandering singers, or the court musicians, or the members of the Brotherhood without banners. Hot Pie survived by recognizing when to stop moving, when to set down the journey and the quest and the adventure, and simply try to live as normally as possible in a world that made normalcy almost impossible. He survived by knowing himself and acting on that knowledge rather than trying to be someone he was not. And he found a kind of fulfillment in his work, in his baking, in the simple pride of doing something well and feeding people and creating small beauties in the form of cleverly shaped bread loaves. But Hot Pie is not the only person in the narratives who set down performance, who stopped singing, or who chose other paths. We might think of Sansa Stark, who had been taught to sing as part of her education as a noble lady, who had a sweet voice that she used in the appropriate social context, performing at feasts or in private chambers when asked. Sansa's singing was never professional, never central to her identity in the way that it was for dedicated performers, but it was still a part of her life, a skill she possessed and occasionally used. As Sansa's circumstances deteriorated, as she became a prisoner in King's Landing and then a fugitive fleeing the capital, her singing largely stopped. Not because she lost her voice or her skill, but because singing was associated with a particular kind of a life, a particular set of circumstances that no longer existed for her. The sweet songs of courtly romance and chivalric ideals seemed hollow and even mocking in the face of the brutal reality she was experiencing. The gentle melodies she'd performed in her father's hall at Winterfell belonged to a world that was gone, a childhood that had ended with terrible abruptness. Sansa's silence, her choice to largely stop singing, was not a conscious decision in the way that Hot Pie's choice to stay at the inn was conscious. It was more of a gradual fading, a recognition that the old forms no longer fit the new reality, that singing belonged to a person she had been but was no longer. The songs were still in her, presumably, the melodies and lyrics still remembered, but they remained unperformed, held in silence because to perform them would be to pretend that nothing had changed, to maintain a fiction that Sansa could no longer sustain. We might also consider Tyrion Lannister, who loved music and often called for singers to perform at his feasts and private gatherings, who had a reasonable voice himself and could carry a tune when drunk enough to try. Tyrion understood music, appreciated it in ways that suggested real aesthetic sensibility, but he was never a performer in any serious sense. Music was a pleasure for him, one of many, something to be enjoyed rather than something to be created or dedicated oneself to. And yet there were moments when Tyrion sang, brief instances when he chose to perform rather than just to listen and appreciate. These moments of Tyrion's singing were almost always ironic or self-mocking, his choice of songs and his manner of performance deliberately undercutting any pretension or seriousness. He might sing bawdy tavern songs while drinking with his sellswords, or perform mock-serious ballads that made fun of the very genre they represented. His singing was a form of commentary, a way of creating distance from the material even while engaging with it. Very characteristic of his general approach to life, and to his own uncomfortable position within his family and society. But as Tyrion's life became more desperate, as he was accused of Joffrey's murder and forced to flee Westeros, as he travelled through Essos in circumstances that were often degrading and dangerous, his singing too largely stopped. Like Sansa, he did not make a conscious decision to stop performing. But the moments of playful song became rarer, and then essentially ceased. The ironic distance that had characterized his earlier performances required a certain kind of security, a position from which one could afford to mock and comment. When that security disappeared, when survival became a more immediate concern, the singing went with it. Throughout the small folk populations of Westeros, there must have been countless similar stories. People who sang while they worked, or for their own entertainment, who had modest skills and took modest pleasure in using them, but who stopped when circumstances made singing seem inappropriate, or impossible, or simply too much effort to maintain. The servants who sang while washing clothes or cleaning chambers, whose songs helped pass the time and made the labour more bearable, fell silent when war came to their regions. When the great houses they served were destroyed, or when they themselves became refugees fleeing violence. The farmers who sang while planting or harvesting, whose songs were as much a part of the agricultural cycle as the weather and the seasons, found their songs dying in their throats when their fields were burned and their livestock stolen. When starvation became a real possibility, and all energy had to be devoted to simple survival. The mothers who sang lullabies to their children continued longer than most, perhaps, maintaining this one small ritual even when everything else had fallen apart, but even they might eventually fall silent when their children died or were taken from them, when the comfort a lullaby could provide seemed meaningless against the magnitude of loss and suffering. These silences, these individual decisions or circumstances that led people to stop singing, represent a kind of loss that is difficult to quantify or even to fully recognise. Each silent voice is a thread broken, a connection severed, a small light extinguished. Multiply these individual silences by thousands or tens of thousands, by all the people across the war-torn regions of Westeros who stopped singing during the conflict, and the cumulative loss becomes staggering, even though it is almost entirely unrecorded and unmemorialized. And yet the decision to stop singing, when it was a choice rather than a circumstance imposed from outside, carried its own kind of wisdom. To recognize that one's voice was not strong enough, that one's situation was not suitable, that survival required different priorities than performance. This recognition was realistic rather than defeatist. The wandering singers who kept singing despite everything deserve respect for their persistence and their dedication to their craft. But those who stopped, who chose other paths or adapted to change circumstances by setting down their instruments and their songs, also deserve respect for their self-knowledge and their flexibility. Hot Pie's transformation from a boy who hummed while kneading dough to a young man who poured his creativity into baking rather than into music represents one version of this adaptive survival. He did not lose his fundamental nature, his desire to create and to take pride in his work, but he found a different outlet for it, one that better suited his circumstances and his capabilities. The direwolf bread was not a song, but it was made with the same spirit that animates song, the desire to make something meaningful, to communicate something beyond mere utility. In the broader sweep of Westerosi history, these small transformations, these individual decisions to stop performing or to channel creativity into different forms, are invisible. The histories record the great singers who performed for kings, the musicians whose songs shaped public opinion, or whose deaths illustrated the dangers of proximity to power. But they do not record the baker's apprentice who stopped humming, or the servant who stopped singing while she worked, or the mother whose lullabies died with her children. These silences are part of the cost of war, part of what is lost when societies tear themselves apart in conflict, but they are costs that are almost never counted or acknowledged. And yet we might reflect that the ability to start singing again, to resume performance after a period of silence, is also part of the human story. Not everyone who stopped singing stopped forever. Some, when circumstances improved, when safety returned, or at least when immediate danger receded, found their voices again, picked up instruments they had set aside, remembered songs they thought they had forgotten. The resilience of song, its ability to survive periods of silence and re-emerge when conditions allowed, is perhaps as remarkable as its ability to persist through continuous performance. Hot Pie may yet sing again, may find himself humming while he works in his kitchen at the inn, may teach his songs and rhymes to children if he someday has any, may participate in the gradual rebuilding of musical culture that will happen if and when peace returns to Westeros. The silence he chose, or that was forced upon him during the worst periods, was not necessarily permanent. Not a final ending, but potentially a pause, a gathering of breath before the next song begins. This possibility of renewal, of return, of finding one's voice again after loss and silence, offers a kind of hope that is different from but perhaps as important as the hope represented by those who never stopped singing in the first place. While we have been contemplating the individual choices that led some singers to stop performing, to set down their instruments and find other ways to survive, we should perhaps also consider how the War of the Five Kings changed the very nature of song itself, how conflict transformed what was sung and why, how music became entangled with violence and politics in ways that went far beyond mere entertainment. The relationship between music and war is ancient and complex. Songs have always marched with armies and commemorated battles, but the particular circumstances of this conflict created particular pressures and particular transformations that are worth examining as we drift through this landscape of sound and silence. War changes everything it touches, and music was no exception. In peacetime, song served primarily as entertainment, as social bonding, as preservation of history and culture, as expression of the full range of human emotions from joy to sorrow. These functions did not disappear during wartime, but they were joined and often overshadowed by new purposes, new uses that transformed song from something primarily innocent into something that could be weaponized, that could carry threats and propaganda, that could intimidate enemies or rally allies, that could shape how people understood the conflict and their place within it. The most famous example of a song used as a weapon, a piece of music that carried explicit threat and that was performed with the intention of creating fear rather than pleasure, was surely the Rains of Castamere. This song, which became almost synonymous with House Lannister during the war, had a history that predated the conflict by decades, a history that was itself a story of violence and the use of music to memorialise and threaten. To understand how the Rains of Castamere functioned during the War of the Five Kings, we need to go back to its origins, to the events that inspired its composition and gave it its particular weight and meaning. The Rains of Castamere referred to the destruction of House Rain of Castamere, a powerful vassal house of the Lannisters in the Westerlands. This destruction occurred during the youth of Tywin Lannister, when his father Tytos was Lord of Casterly Rock and was widely perceived as weak, as too soft and forgiving, as allowing the Lannisters' vassals to grow too independent and too bold in their defiance of Lannister authority. The Rains, along with House Tarbeck, rose in rebellion against Lannister rule. Believing that Tytos would not or could not effectively respond to their challenge, but it was not Tytos who responded. It was his son Tywin, then a young man but already showing the ruthlessness and strategic thinking that would characterise his entire life. Tywin crushed the rebellion with a thoroughness that was terrifying in its completeness. He destroyed House Tarbeck utterly, killing all of its members and razing their castle, and then he turned to Castamere, the stronghold of House Rain, a castle that was partially built into mines beneath a hill with extensive underground chambers and passages. The Rains retreated into these mines, believing themselves safe underground, protected by stone and depth from whatever Tywin might attempt. Tywin's response was to seal the entrances to the mines and then to divert a nearby stream so that water poured into the underground chambers, flooding them completely. Everyone inside drowned, the entire House Rain eliminated in a single action, their castle becoming their tomb. The Rains of Castamere were not the gentle rains that fall from the sky to nourish crops and fill streams, but the terrible waters that drowned an entire noble house, that ended a bloodline that had existed for centuries. The Rains of Castamere was composed after this event, though by whom we do not know. The original composer lost to history in the way that composers so often are when their songs become traditional. The song told the story of the Rain's destruction, but it told it from a particular angle, with a particular emphasis. It focused on the hubris of House Rain, on their assumption that they could defy the Lannisters and survive, on their fatal miscalculation of Tywin's will and capability. And it included the detail about the underground chambers flooding, about the rains that fell not from the sky but from diverted streams, about the complete and final nature of the destruction. The song became a Lannister anthem of sorts, not official but widely recognised, associated with House Lannister and particularly with Tywin himself. Its message was clear and unmistakable. This is what happens to those who defy us. This is the fate that awaits anyone who challenges Lannister power. The song was a warning wrapped in music, a threat made beautiful through melody and poetry, and everyone in the Westlands understood what it meant when a Lannister called for the Rains of Castamere to be performed. During the War of the Five Kings, the song took on new significance and new uses. Tywin employed it deliberately as a psychological weapon, having it performed in contexts where its message would be heard and understood by those he wanted to intimidate. When he was dealing with difficult negotiations or facing potential resistance, the sudden appearance of musicians performing the Rains of Castamere served as a reminder of what Tywin was capable of what he had done to House Rain, and what he might do to anyone else who opposed him. The song said, without saying it explicitly, "Remember Castamere, remember what happens to rebels, remember that the Lannisters do not forgive and do not forget." The most terrible use of the Rains of Castamere came at the Red Wedding, the massacre at the Twins where Robb Stark and most of his forces were betrayed and murdered by the Freys and Boltons acting in concert with Tywin Lannister. The musicians at the wedding, who had been playing pleasant songs appropriate to the celebration, suddenly switched to the Rains of Castamere, and this was the signal for the attack to begin. The song played as Robb and his mother Catelyn and his pregnant wife and his bannermen were killed, as the hall filled with violence and screaming and death, as the most sacred laws of hospitality were violated in service of political aims. The use of the song in this context was particularly cruel, transforming music that might have been merely threatening into something that was actively part of the massacre, the soundtrack to murder and betrayal. For anyone who survived the Red Wedding, or who learned of it afterward, the Rains of Castamere would forever be associated with that night, with the worst of what humans are capable of doing to each other. The song was poisoned by its association with the massacre, transformed from a warning into something darker and more terrible, a reminder of a specific atrocity rather than just a general threat. And yet the song persisted, continued to be performed throughout the Seven Kingdoms, because it was useful to the Lannisters and to those who allied with them. To sing the Rains of Castamere was to signal loyalty to House Lannister, to acknowledge their power and their willingness to use it, to participate in the creation and maintenance of the atmosphere of fear that the Lannisters used to control those who might otherwise resist. Singers who wanted to please Lannister lords or to perform safely in Lannister-controlled territories learned the song and performed it, whether they personally agreed with its message or not, whether they felt any enthusiasm for what it represented, or simply recognised the practical necessity of giving audiences what they wanted. The psychological impact of hearing the Rains of Castamere after the Red Wedding cannot be overstated. For those who opposed the Lannisters, the song became a source of terror and rage, a reminder of their powerlessness and the terrible price that had been paid for rebellion. For those who supported the Lannisters or who tried to remain neutral, the song was a warning to stay in line, to maintain loyalty, to never give Tywin reason to think of them as enemies. The song worked on people's minds, creating associations and emotions that went far beyond the literal content of the lyrics, functioning as a kind of auditory symbol that could trigger complex reactions in listeners who understood its full significance. But Quote 1-2 was not the only song to emerge from or be transformed by the war. There were songs about Robb Stark, the young wolf, who had won every battle but lost the war, whose death at the Red Wedding became the subject of ballads that varied wildly depending on who was singing them and for whom. In regions that had supported Robb, the songs portrayed him as a tragic hero, a brave young king betrayed by those who should have protected him, a victim of dishonourable enemies who could not defeat him in fair combat and so resorted to treachery. These songs were dangerous to sing openly in Lannister-controlled territories, but they persisted in the north and in other regions where Stark sympathies remained strong, kept alive by singers who risked punishment to preserve the memory of the fallen king. In Lannister territories, by contrast, the songs about Robb Stark portrayed him very differently, as a rebel and traitor who broke his oaths and paid the price for his treachery, as someone who brought destruction on himself and his followers through pride and poor judgment. These songs served Lannister interests by justifying the Red Wedding, by transforming what might have been seen as a dishonourable massacre into something like righteous punishment. The truth of Robb's character and the nature of his cause was contested in song as it was in politics and warfare, with different versions of the story competing for acceptance and influence. Similarly, there were songs about other major events and figures of the war. Battle songs commemorated victories and mourned defeats, though which battles were celebrated and which were lamented depended entirely on the singer's allegiance, or on the allegiance of the current audience. Songs about Joffrey painted him as either a glorious young king or a monster, depending on political orientation. Songs about Stannis Baratheon portrayed him as either the rightful king fighting for his crown, or as a dangerous fanatic led astray by a foreign priestess. The same events, the same people, the same war, but understood and represented in completely contradictory ways depending on perspective and purpose. These competing narratives in song mattered, because most people in Westeros could not read, relied on oral culture for their understanding of current events and history, learned about the war through songs and stories rather than through written accounts or personal observation. A singer's choice of which version to perform, which interpretation to offer, shaped how audiences understood the conflict, influenced who they supported or at least who they believed deserved support. This gave singers a certain kind of power, limited but real, the power to influence opinion and memory, and it also made them targets when they chose or seemed to choose the wrong side. The danger of singing the wrong song to the wrong audience was very real during the war. A singer who performed pro-Stark songs in Lannister territory might be beaten or killed, his death justified as punishment for treason or sedition. A singer who performed Lannister songs in the north might face similar consequences. The neutral songs, the traditional pieces that had nothing to do with current politics, became safer choices. But even these were not entirely safe because the choice to avoid political songs could itself be read as a political statement, as an attempt to remain neutral when neutrality was seen as cowardice or betrayal. Some singers tried to maintain repertoires that could work for any audience, learning both pro-Lannister and pro-Stark versions of songs about the war, performing whichever version seemed appropriate or safe given the current circumstances. This adaptability was survival skill, but it was also morally complicated, requiring singers to perform songs whose messages they might personally oppose, to celebrate victories they might privately mourn, to mourn defeats they might privately celebrate. The disconnect between public performance and private belief, between what one sang and what one felt, created a kind of spiritual damage that is difficult to measure, but surely real. Music also served as a way to mourn and process grief in circumstances where open mourning might be dangerous. A mother who lost her son fighting for Robb Stark could not openly grieve in Lannister territory after the Stark cause collapsed, could not speak of her son as a hero or honour his memory publicly. But she might sing lullabies that she had sung to him when he was small, might perform traditional mourning songs that ostensibly commemorated ancestors, but that carried her private grief for her recently dead son. The songs became covers for emotions that could not be safely expressed directly, vessels for feelings that had to be hidden but that could not be entirely suppressed. The gentle songs, the lullabies and love songs, and simple tunes about nature and the seasons took on new importance during the war precisely because they offered refuge from the constant pressure of conflict and politics. A singer performing a sweet song about spring flowers or young love was not making any political statement, was not taking sides or risking offence, was simply offering a moment of beauty and normalcy in a world that had become brutal and strange. These songs were valuable because they reminded people of what life had been like before the war and what it might be like again if peace ever returned, because they provided emotional relief and a kind of gentle escapism that was psychologically necessary for maintaining sanity in insane circumstances. Children's songs and nursery rhymes persisted throughout the war, taught by mothers to their children, sung in quiet moments when work was done and before sleep came. These songs were perhaps the most resilient of all, the most resistant to being transformed or weaponized by the conflict, because they existed in a sphere that was primarily domestic and intimate. Protected somewhat from the public world of politics and war. A lullaby sung to help a child sleep was the same whether the family supported Lannister or Stark or tried to remain neutral, whether they lived in the north or the Reach or the Riverlands, whether they were rich or poor or somewhere between, and yet even children's songs could carry new meanings during wartime. Traditional rhymes about kings and queens and battles took on fresh relevance when real kings and queens were fighting real battles. Songs that had been merely playful became grimly prophetic or painfully ironic. The old song about the king in the north, a figure from legend and the distant past, became current again when Robb Stark claimed that title, and then became a mourning song after his death, a reminder of how short his reign had been and how completely his cause had failed. The singers who died during the war are largely uncounted and unmemorialized, their deaths absorbed into the general casualty figures without specific recognition of their profession or their loss. When armies clashed or cities were sacked or castles were besieged, the singers present were killed along with everyone else, their instruments destroyed, their songs silenced. Some died quickly in the chaos of battle or massacre. Others died slowly from wounds or disease or starvation, lingering in pain until death finally came. The manner of their deaths was probably not very different from the manner of deaths of soldiers or servants or any of the other countless people who died in the conflict, but their deaths represented a particular kind of loss, a silencing of voices that had made beauty and meaning, that had preserved culture and history. We might imagine a singer killed during the sack of a town, his harp smashed and his throat cut, his final song ending in mid-verse never to be completed. Or a singer who died of fever in a military camp, delirious and calling for water, his beautiful voice reduced to incoherent mumbling before silence. Or a singer who starved slowly in a besieged city, growing weaker day by day until he could no longer perform, could no longer even speak, becoming just another emaciated corpse among many, when the city finally fell or the siege was lifted. These deaths matter, not because singers are more valuable than other people, but because each death was a unique loss, a particular voice and particular skills and particular knowledge gone forever. The songs that survived the war, that persisted and were passed down to later generations, became vessels of memory in ways that were both accurate and deeply distorted. Songs preserved emotional truths even when they got factual details wrong, captured how events felt even when they misrepresented exactly what happened. The Red Wedding was remembered in song as even more terrible than it actually was, if such a thing is possible, the details exaggerated and dramatized, the horror amplified through retelling until the historical event and its legendary representation became difficult to separate. But the songs also preserved the essential truth of the betrayal, the violation of sacred hospitality, the murder of a king and his followers, in ways that dry historical chronicles might not capture. Similarly, battles were remembered in songs that turned chaos and confusion into coherent narratives, that gave meaning and pattern to events that participants experienced as formless and terrifying. The songs were not accurate in any literal sense, but they were true to the experience of war, to the emotions and the trauma, and the attempts to make sense of senseless violence. A soldier who survived a battle might not recognize the specific details in a song about that battle, might know that events didn't happen quite the way the song described, but might still feel that the song captured something essential about the experience. Something about fear or courage or loss or survival that the song expressed better than factual description could. As the war ground on and casualties mounted, and the initial clear purposes of the conflict became muddied by betrayals and shifting alliances and simple exhaustion, the songs began to reflect this disillusionment and confusion. Earlier war songs had been relatively straightforward in their loyalties and their narratives, clearly pro one side or another, confident in their interpretations of events and characters. Later songs became more ambiguous, more questioning, more likely to express doubt or sorrow, or a kind of weary recognition that perhaps no one was entirely right and no one was entirely wrong, that the war had become a machine that consumed people regardless of the justness of their causes. There were songs that questioned whether any of it had been worth it, whether the deaths and destruction had achieved anything valuable or meaningful, whether the survivors were better off than they would have been if the war had never happened. These songs were dangerous in their own way, dangerous because they undermined the narratives that the various factions needed to maintain, that justified the sacrifices and explained why the war had to continue. But they were also honest, expressing what many people felt but could not say openly, giving voice to doubts and griefs that had no other outlet. The transformation of music during the War of the Five Kings, its weaponization and its fragmentation into competing narratives, its service as both propaganda and genuine expression, represents a kind of loss even beyond the deaths of individual singers. Something about the innocence of song was damaged, perhaps irreparably, by its entanglement with violence and politics. Music that had been primarily about beauty and community and shared human experience became a tool and a weapon, became something that could frighten and threaten as easily as it could comfort and unite. And yet, we might also recognise that this transformation revealed something that had perhaps always been true, but was less visible in peacetime, that music has never been separate from power and politics. Songs have always served multiple purposes, including some that are manipulative or coercive. The war made these purposes explicit and undeniable, stripped away the pretense that music exists in some pure aesthetic realm, untouched by the compromises and cruelties of the world. This revelation was painful, but perhaps ultimately valuable. A recognition of what music actually is and does rather than what we might wish it to be. While songs and singers navigated the dangerous waters of wartime performance, where every choice of melody or lyric could carry political weight and potential consequence, there existed another category of performer whose relationship to music and entertainment was different, and in some ways even more complex. These were the fools and jesters, the professional comedians and physical entertainers whose role was not primarily to create beauty or preserve history, but to amuse, to make people laugh, to provide relief from the weight of life through humour and spectacle. The fool occupied a peculiar position in Westerosi society, simultaneously marginal and central, powerless, and yet granted certain liberties that others could never claim, despised and yet necessary. A figure of mockery who sometimes possessed more wisdom than those who mocked him. The tradition of the fool, the licensed jester who could say things that would get anyone else punished or killed, was old and widespread throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Great houses maintained fools as they maintained singers and other entertainers, though the fool's position was perhaps even more precarious, because it depended entirely on the lord's sense of humour and tolerance for being the subject of jokes. A fool who misjudged his master's mood, or crossed invisible lines that were never clearly marked, could find himself out of favour with devastating suddenness, his licence to speak freely revoked, his special protection stripped away, leaving him just another servant who had given offence and would be punished accordingly. The fool's humour was supposed to be gentle enough not to truly wound, but sharp enough to be genuinely funny, a nearly impossible balance that required constant attention and adjustment. A fool who was too timid, whose jokes never carried any real bite, would be boring and would fail to fulfil his function. But a fool who was too bold, who mocked his master too effectively or revealed too much truth through his comedy, would be dangerous and would likely not survive long. The best fools walked this line with remarkable skill, finding ways to speak truths that everyone knew but no one could say, wrapping criticism in humour until it became palatable, making people laugh at themselves and their situations in ways that provided genuine relief and perspective. But not all fools fit this traditional model of the clever jester who used wit and wordplay to entertain. Some fools were not clever at all, at least not in conventional ways. Some were simple or damaged or mad, their foolishness not an act but a genuine condition, and yet they were kept and valued by lords and ladies who found their strangeness amusing or touching, or somehow necessary. These natural fools, as they were sometimes called, occupied an even more complicated position than the professional jesters, because their entertainment value came from what they were rather than what they did, from the fact of their difference rather than from any calculated performance. Patchface, the fool who served at Dragonstone and later accompanied Stannis Baratheon's household, was perhaps the strangest and most disturbing of all the fools we encounter in the histories of this period. Patchface had not always been a fool, not always been the damaged, prophetic figure he became. Once, years before the events we have been discussing, he had been a boy from the Summer Isles or perhaps from Volantis. The accounts vary, purchased or given as a gift to Lord Steffon Baratheon when Steffon visited the Free Cities on a mission for King Aerys II. The boy was said to be remarkably clever and talented, able to juggle and perform acrobatics, to tell jokes in multiple languages, to do all the things that a skilled court fool should do. Lord Steffon brought the boy back with him on his journey to Westeros, intending to present him to the king, or perhaps to keep him for his own court at Storm's End. But the ship encountered a terrible storm in Shipbreaker Bay, within sight of Storm's End itself, and it went down in the violent waters. Lord Stefan and his wife both drowned, witnessed by their sons Robert and Stannis, who stood on the walls and could do nothing to save their parents. The clever fool boy also drowned, or seemed to, his body disappearing beneath the waves along with everyone else aboard the doomed vessel. But then, days later, the boy's body washed up on the shore, and somehow, impossibly, he was still alive. He had been underwater for days, had drowned in any reasonable sense, and yet he lived. The experience had changed him profoundly and terribly. His skin had turned pale and mottled, covered in strange discolorations that would never fade. His mind had broken, or transformed, or opened to something that human minds are perhaps not meant to perceive. He could no longer perform the clever tricks he had once done, could barely speak in coherent sentences, seemed to have lost everything that had made him valuable as an entertainer. What remained was Patchface, a name given to him because of his mottled skin, and because he wore a costume of motley. Patched clothing that marked him as a fool, though he could no longer fool in the traditional sense. Patchface became part of Stannis Baratheon's household, though why Stannis kept him is not entirely clear. Perhaps it was some sense of obligation, Patchface being the only survivor of the shipwreck that killed Stannis' parents, a living reminder of that tragedy. Perhaps it was pity for the damaged boy who had nowhere else to go. Or perhaps even the stern and practical Stannis recognised something in Patchface that was valuable, or at least interesting, something worth preserving despite the strangeness. Patchface sang, or at least he made songs of a sort. Though they were unlike any traditional songs, his verses were short and cryptic, often nonsensical on the surface, full of images of the sea and things beneath the waves, references to drowned men and sunken treasures, and the things that swim in the deep places. He sang about what he knew, we might presume, about the experience of drowning and whatever he saw or experienced during those days underwater, before he washed ashore alive but transformed. His songs had a rhythm to them. A kind of music, though the melodies were strange and the words were stranger. The disturbing thing about Patchface's songs, the thing that made people uncomfortable and even frightened around him, was that they seemed to predict the future. Or at least, after events occurred, people would remember that Patchface had sung something that seemed to foretell what happened, that matched the events too closely to be mere coincidence. He sang of crowns beneath the sea before Stannis lost his bid for the Iron Throne. He sang of red rain and dancing bears before terrible events that involved violence and betrayal. The specifics were never clear enough to serve as actual warnings, the prophecies only recognisable as such in retrospect, but the pattern was consistent enough to be unnerving. Whether Patchface actually could see the future, or whether his cryptic songs were simply vague enough that they could be interpreted to match almost anything that happened, is impossible to determine with certainty. Perhaps his damaged mind had indeed opened to some kind of prophetic vision, had been changed by his drowning into something that could perceive patterns and possibilities that normal consciousness cannot access. Or perhaps people simply remembered the songs that seemed to match events, and forgot the many songs that meant nothing, creating an illusion of prophecy through selective memory, and the human tendency to find patterns even where none exist. What is clear is that Patchface disturbed most people who encountered him. His mottled skin and his broken mind, his strange songs and his unnatural survival, all of this marked him as something uncanny, something that did not fit into the normal categories of human experience. Servants avoided him when they could. Lords and ladies were uncomfortable in his presence, though they might not show it openly. Even Stannis, not a man given to superstition or fear of the unknown, seemed uneasy around Patchface, tolerating his presence but not embracing it, keeping the fool but keeping him at a certain distance. The exception was Shireen Baratheon, Stannis' daughter, who loved Patchface without reservation or fear. Shireen herself was marked and damaged, her face scarred by greyscale that she had survived as an infant, and perhaps this created a bond between her and the damaged fool. Or perhaps it was simply that Shireen had known Patchface her entire life, had grown up with his strange songs and his mottled skin, and so to her he was not frightening but familiar, not uncanny but simply Patchface. Her friend and companion who sang to her and made her laugh with his odd pronouncements, and his occasional attempts at juggling that rarely succeeded but were endearing in their failure. Shireen's affection for Patchface was one of the few sources of gentleness in her otherwise rather bleak childhood at Dragonstone. With a father who was stern and distant, and a mother who was cold and increasingly fanatical in her devotion to the Red God R'hllor, Patchface provided something that no one else in Shireen's life could or would provide, a kind of uncomplicated companionship, a presence that made no demands and offered no judgments, that simply was there and was strange and was somehow comforting in its strangeness. When Patchface sang his cryptic songs about the sea and the things beneath the waves, Shireen listened and laughed and did not worry about whether they were prophecies or madness, or simply the confused utterances of a broken mind. The loneliness of Patchface's existence, despite or perhaps because of Shireen's affection, is worth contemplating. He was always performing in a sense, always being Patchface the fool, never able to simply be a person without the weight of his strangeness and his role. Even his madness was a kind of performance, something that others observed and reacted to, that defined how they related to him. He could not have normal conversations or normal relationships, because his mind did not work in normal ways, could not process experience or express himself through the usual channels of human communication. His songs were the primary way he interacted with the world, and those songs were incomprehensible to most people, frightening to many, meaningful only to Shireen, who loved him without needing to understand him. The tradition of the fool who speaks truth through madness or humour, who can say things that sane people or serious people cannot say, was ancient and recognised throughout the Seven Kingdoms, but it existed in tension with the reality that fools were also marginalised and vulnerable, dependent on the tolerance and protection of those they served. Patchface represented the extreme version of this tradition, a fool whose wisdom, if it was wisdom, was so wrapped in strangeness that it was almost impossible to access, whose truth if he spoke truth was so cryptic that it could only be recognised after the fact, when it was too late to act on it. If Patchface represented one end of the fool spectrum, the natural fool whose condition was genuine and whose performance was not calculated, then the professional jesters like Moonboy represented the other end, fools whose foolishness was entirely an act, a role they performed for money and security, putting on and taking off their motley as a craftsman might put on and take off his apron. Moonboy served in King's Landing during the reigns of Robert Baratheon and his supposed sons, entertaining at court with jokes and physical comedy, tumbling and juggling and making faces and voices that delighted, or at least distracted the nobles who watched him. Moonboy's real name is not recorded in the histories, which is itself revealing of the fool's marginal status. He was known only by his professional name, his identity consumed by his role. As though he had no existence outside of being a fool. We know relatively little about Moonboy's background or his thoughts or his private life, if he had a private life, if there was a person beneath the costume and the performance. What we know is that he was skilled at his profession, good enough to maintain his position at court through multiple changes in regime, adaptable enough to entertain Robert's rough humour and Joffrey's cruel tastes, and the various courtiers and visitors who passed through the Red Keep. The rumour, never confirmed but widely believed, was that Moonboy became one of Queen Cersei's lovers during her marriage to Robert, continuing the relationship even after Robert's death. Whether this rumour was true is impossible to determine with certainty. Cersei herself never confirmed it, and Moonboy was in no position to speak of such matters openly even if they had occurred. The rumour may have been started by Cersei's enemies to mock and discredit her, suggesting that she would lower herself to lie with a fool, someone beneath her in every social and practical sense, Or the rumour may have been true, Cersei seeking comfort or excitement or simple human contact wherever she could find it, caring less about Moonboy's status than about his availability and his discretion. If the relationship did occur, it would have been dangerous for both parties, but especially for Moonboy. Cersei was the queen, powerful and protected despite her enemies, but Moonboy was just a fool, disposable and vulnerable, with no family or faction to defend him, if he became inconvenient or if knowledge of the relationship needed to be suppressed. The relationship, if it existed, was almost certainly doomed to end badly for Moonboy, because relationships between queens and fools do not end well when they are discovered, or when circumstances change and the queen decides that the fool knows too much or poses too much risk. Moonboy's ultimate fate is unclear in the historical record, but it was almost certainly not pleasant. Fools who knew dangerous secrets tended to disappear or to die in accidents, or to simply stop appearing at court without explanation. The powerful could silence those who threatened them with relative ease, and a fool's life was not valued highly enough that his disappearance would prompt investigation or consequence. Perhaps Moonboy died during the war, killed in one of the many upheavals that shook King's Landing. Perhaps he fled the city and survived somewhere else under a different name, abandoning his profession and his motley and his identity as Moonboy. Or perhaps Cersei had him killed when she decided he was too dangerous to leave alive, his body disposed of quietly, his absence barely noticed in the chaos of the times. The professional jester's existence was built on a fundamental paradox. He was supposed to be funny, to make people laugh, to lighten the mood and provide entertainment, but he existed in environments that were often deadly serious, where the wrong word could mean death, where the powerful people he entertained were capable of terrible cruelty and were not always in the mood to be mocked even gently. The jester had to read his audience with perfect accuracy, had to know when humour was welcome and when it was dangerous, had to perform with energy and creativity while simultaneously monitoring the reactions of those watching, ready to shift tone or approach if he sensed displeasure or danger. The loneliness of this existence was profound. The jester could not have genuine relationships with those he entertained because the relationship was always fundamentally unequal, always defined by his role as entertainer and their role as audience. He could not fully trust anyone because trust required vulnerability, and the jester was always performing, always maintaining the mask of foolishness that was his protection and his prison. Even with other fools or other performers, relationships were complicated by competition for positions and by the knowledge that anyone might betray anyone else if it meant securing favour or avoiding punishment. Butterbumps was another named fool who appears briefly in the histories, serving Lady Lisa Arryn at the Eyrie. He was enormously fat, hence his name, and his primary entertainment value seemed to come from his size and his ability to sing despite his bulk, his voice incongruously beautiful coming from such an ungainly body. Butterbumps represented yet another variation on the fool theme, someone whose physical difference was part of what made him entertaining, whose body was as much his act as his singing or his wit. The cruelty implicit in this, the fact that people found his fatness amusing in itself, was probably not lost on Butterbumps himself, but he had little choice but to accept it if he wanted to maintain his position and his livelihood. Beyond the court fools with their individual names and their particular circumstances, there existed a broader world of travelling entertainers, jongleurs and physical performers who made their living at fairs and tournaments and festivals, who juggled and tumbled and walked on stilts and breathed fire and performed tricks that amazed and delighted audiences. These performers were even more marginal than court fools, even more dependent on the transient goodwill of audiences, even more vulnerable to the dangers of the road and the unpredictability of public favour. A juggler might spend years perfecting his craft, learning to keep 5 or 7 or even 9 objects in the air simultaneously, developing the timing and coordination and concentration that such performance requires. And then an injury to his hand or his eye, something that would be a minor inconvenience to most people, could end his career entirely, could transform him from a skilled professional into someone with no marketable skills and no way to earn a living. The acrobat who could flip and twist and balance on wires or on other people's shoulders was performing feats that required youth and flexibility and strength, and these qualities inevitably faded with age, meaning that even successful acrobats faced the certainty of decline and the need to find something else to do when their bodies could no longer perform the tricks that had sustained them. The fire breather, who learned to spit oil through a torch to create dramatic plumes of flame, risked burning himself seriously every single time he performed, risked damage to his lungs from the fumes, risked the accumulated effects of repeatedly doing something that the human body was never designed to do. And for what reward? A few copper coins from an appreciative crowd, enough to eat for a day or two, the transient pleasure of applause and attention. The knowledge that he had done something difficult and beautiful, and that people had noticed and appreciated it. The calculation hardly seemed worth it from the outside, and yet people made these choices, devoted their lives to these dangerous and uncertain professions, found meaning and purpose in entertaining others even when the cost was high and the rewards were meagre. At tournaments and fairs, the entertainers competed with each other for audience attention and for the coins that spectators might throw. A juggler might set up his pitch and begin his act, only to lose half his audience to a more charismatic storyteller or a more impressive acrobat who started performing nearby. The market for entertainment was competitive and unforgiving, rewarding those who were most skilled or most novel or simply most fortunate in their timing and location, leaving others to struggle for whatever scraps remained. There was no security, no guarantee that the act that worked well yesterday would work well today, no protection against the countless variables that determine success or failure. And yet, in this world of competitive performance and constant uncertainty, there was also community of a sort, performers helping each other, sharing information about good venues and dangerous territories, pooling resources when times were hard, creating informal networks of mutual support that helped people survive circumstances that would otherwise be unbearable. A juggler who broke his wrist might be helped by other performers who covered his expenses until he healed, knowing that they might need similar help someday. An acrobat troupe might take in a solo performer who was struggling, giving them a place in the group and a share of the earnings in exchange for their particular skills, or simply out of fellow feeling and recognition of shared vulnerability. The humour that fools and jesters provided served important social functions beyond mere entertainment, though we should be careful not to overstate this importance or to romanticize what was often a difficult and demeaning existence. Laughter provided release from tension, allowed people to process anxiety and fear and anger in ways that were less destructive than direct expression might have been. A joke about the king or about the war or about the unfairness of life made these things bearable by making them absurd, by creating distance through mockery, by asserting some small degree of control through the act of laughing at what could not be changed. The fool's ability to speak truths that others could not speak, to point out absurdities and hypocrisies that everyone saw but no one mentioned, served as a kind of safety valve for social tension. When a fool mocked a lord's pretensions or pointed out the inconsistencies in official narratives, he was saying what common people thought but could not say, giving voice to frustrations and observations that had no other outlet. This was dangerous for the fool himself, but it was valuable for society, providing a mechanism for dissent and criticism that existed within acceptable bounds, that could be dismissed as mere foolery if it became too threatening, but that still circulated ideas and perspectives that challenged authority. But we should also recognize the cost of this role, the burden placed on fools to be the voices of truth through mockery, to carry the weight of saying what others would not say while being simultaneously mocked themselves and granted no real power or protection. The fool was useful precisely because he was powerless, because his words could be dismissed and he could be punished if he went too far, His license to speak freely was always conditional, always subject to revocation, always dependent on the tolerance of those he mocked. As we move forward in our exploration of music and performance in Westeros, we'll shift from these professional entertainers, these court fools and travelling jongleurs, to the songs themselves, to the actual music that persisted across all these different performers and contexts. But perhaps we should carry with us some understanding of the complexity and difficulty of the entertainer's existence, the thin line between pleasing and endangering oneself, the loneliness of always performing and never quite being allowed to simply be human without the weight of one's role. While we have been contemplating the performers themselves, the singers and fools and jesters who moved through Westeros entertaining and surviving, and sometimes failing to survive, we might now turn our attention to something that in many ways transcends the individual performer, something that persists even when singers are silenced and fools are forgotten. The songs themselves, the actual music and lyrics that were performed across the Seven Kingdoms, carried meanings and histories that existed independently of any particular voice that sang them. A singer might die, but the song could continue, passed from one performer to another, from one generation to the next, changing slightly with each retelling but maintaining some essential core of meaning and melody that made it recognizable as the same song despite all the variations. The oral tradition through which most Westerosi songs were preserved and transmitted was both remarkably resilient and inherently unstable. Resilient because songs could survive for centuries without being written down, pass through countless performances and countless performers, maintaining their identity through changes of dynasty and shifts of culture, and even the transformation of the language in which they were sung. Unstable because each performance was also an act of recreation, an interpretation that might introduce new elements or drop old ones, that might shift emphasis or alter details in ways that accumulated over time, until a song's current version might be quite different from what it had been when first composed. Even though the process of change was so gradual that no one could point to the exact moment when transformation occurred. Consider quote 13, perhaps the most widely known and frequently performed song in all of Westeros, a piece that appeared in countless variations across the Seven Kingdoms, and that nearly every singer knew at least one version of, that tavern-goers would sing along with, when drunk enough or cheerful enough to join their voices with the performers. The song told the story of a maiden who encountered a bear in the woods, and the bear wanted to dance with her, and through verses that were sometimes ribald and sometimes relatively innocent, their interaction was described with language that carried obvious sexual metaphor while maintaining the surface story of a girl and a bear. The appeal of the bear and the maiden fair was multi-layered and worked on several levels simultaneously. On the surface, it was a funny song, absurd and playful, with a catchy melody and a rousing chorus that invited participation. The image of a bear dancing was inherently comic. The idea of a maiden's encounter with such a creature in the forest touched on fairy tale elements that were familiar and comforting, even when twisted toward humour. Children could enjoy the song as a silly story about animals, finding delight in the incongruity in the rhythm without necessarily understanding the sexual undertones that adult listeners heard and appreciated. Those sexual undertones were, of course, the song's primary appeal for adult audiences, particularly in taverns and other informal settings where bawdy humour was welcome and expected. The bear represented male sexuality, aggressive and dangerous, but also somewhat clumsy and comic, and the maiden's responses to the bear's advances range from fear to coy resistance to eventual surrender, depending on which version one heard. The metaphor was obvious enough that everyone understood it, but indirect enough that it could be performed in contexts where explicit sexual content would be inappropriate, threading the needle between propriety and impropriety in ways that made the song versatile and widely acceptable. But beyond the surface humour and the sexual metaphor, the bear and the maiden fair also carried meanings about social class and power dynamics, about the relationship between civilization and wildness, about female agency and desire. The maiden in some versions was noble, and the bear's attention was unwelcome, an assault that she resisted or from which she was rescued. In other versions, the maiden was common, and the encounter was more consensual, the bear's wildness attractive rather than threatening, the dance between them playful rather than violent. These variations reflected different attitudes about sexuality and gender relations, different assumptions about what was natural or proper or desirable in the interactions between men and women. The regional variations of the bear and the maiden fair were extensive and revealing. In the north, where bears were real animals that people actually encountered and feared, the song tended to emphasize the danger of the bear, the genuine threat it posed to the maiden, and her relief when the encounter ended without harm. The humour was darker, more aware of actual violence, less playful than in southern versions. In the Reach and the Westerlands, where bears were rarer and more likely to be encountered in controlled settings like hunting parks, the song was lighter, more purely comic, the bear more buffoon than predator, the whole thing more obviously a metaphorical dance between the sexes rather than a commentary on actual encounters with dangerous animals. In the Iron Islands, the bear in the maiden fair was less commonly performed, and when it was, the maiden was often portrayed as ironborn and resistant, refusing to dance with the bear, asserting her independence and strength in ways that reflected ironborn values about self-reliance and the refusal to submit. The Dornish versions, meanwhile, were the most explicitly sexual, the least concerned with propriety. The maiden's eventual surrender to the bear's advances portrayed not as defeat, but as willing pleasure, reflecting Dornish comfort with sexuality, and with female desire that was less common in other regions of Westeros. The song structure, with its repeated chorus and its verses that could be added to or dropped depending on how long the performance needed to be, made it highly adaptable to different contexts. A singer could perform a short version with just a few verses if time was limited or the audience seemed restless, or could extend the performance with additional verses if the audience was engaged and wanted more. Some singers had personal verses they had composed themselves, additions that became associated with their particular performances, and occasionally these personal additions would be picked up by other singers and would enter the general repertoire of the song, becoming part of its evolving tradition. Quote 18 represented a different kind of song, one that was more explicitly about regional identity and cultural pride than Quote 19, despite also being bawdy and humorous. The song told the story of a Dornishman's wife who cuckolded her husband with various lovers, describing her infidelities and her husband's obliviousness in verses that were comic, but also carried undertones of admiration for the wife's boldness and cleverness. The song was popular throughout Westeros, but particularly in Dorne itself, where it was performed with a kind of defiant pride, an assertion of Dornish difference from the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. The appeal of the Dornishman's wife for Dornish audiences was complex and not entirely about the literal content of the lyrics. Yes, the song was funny and bawdy and entertaining in straightforward ways, but it was also a statement about Dornish attitudes towards sexuality and gender and marriage that set them apart from the more restrictive and male-dominated cultures of the other kingdoms. In Dorne, women had more rights and more freedom. Female infidelity was not punished as harshly as in other regions. Sexuality was discussed more openly and with less shame. The Dornishman's wife celebrated these differences, made them a source of humour and pride rather than shame or defensiveness. For non-Dornish audiences, the song worked differently, often as a kind of exotic entertainment, a glimpse into a culture that was different and slightly scandalous, that violated norms in ways that were both titillating and slightly disturbing. Singers performing the Dornishman's wife in the Reach or the Vale would play up the foreignness of it, the sense that this was how things were done in far-off Dorne, where customs were strange and women were bold, and audiences would enjoy the song precisely because it represented behaviours that would be unacceptable in their own communities, but that could be enjoyed as fantasy or as commentary on a distant other. The song's persistence across regions, despite its specifically Dornish content, speaks to something about how music travels and transforms. Quote 23 was Dornish in origin and theme, but it became part of the general repertoire of Westerosi song, performed by singers who had never been to Dorne, and for audiences who knew little about actual Dornish culture beyond stereotypes and rumours. The song both represented Dornish identity and distorted it. Both celebrated Dornish difference and reduced it to bawdy humour. Both preserved something authentic about the culture and transformed it into entertainment that could be consumed and misunderstood. Quote 24 represented yet another category of song, one that was tragic rather than comic, that dealt with themes of lost love and broken hearts, and the passage of time rather than with sexual humour or cultural identity. The song told the story of a woman named Jenny who danced among ruins, among the stones of what had once been a great hall or castle but that had fallen into decay, and she danced with the ghosts of those who had died there, with the memories of what had been lost. The lyrics were beautiful and melancholic, the melody haunting. And the song had the power to move listeners to tears or to deep reflection on loss and memory and the impermanence of all human endeavour. The historical Jenny who inspired the song was a figure of some controversy and tragedy in Westerosi history. She was the woman loved by Duncan Targaryen, the Prince of Dragonflies, who gave up his claim to the Iron Throne in order to marry her despite her common birth and despite his family's objections. Their love story was romantic in the way that doomed love stories often are, celebrated in song while the practical consequences, the disruption to succession, and the political complications that followed Duncan's choice were largely forgotten or ignored. Quote 25 focused on Jenny herself, on her dancing among ruins, on her connection to places of loss and memory, but the song carried the weight of the whole story. All the love and sacrifice and consequences compressed into a few verses and a haunting refrain. The ghost of High Heart, the mysterious dwarf woman who possessed prophetic visions, and who travelled with the Brotherhood without banners, loved quote, _26_ with an intensity that suggested personal connection to the song or to its subject. She would request it whenever she encountered singers, would pay for its performance with prophecies or with whatever other currency she had available, would listen with tears streaming down her face as the song unfolded. Her reaction suggested that she had known Jenny personally, or had known the places the song described, or had some deep personal stake in the story that the song told. But she never explained her connection, never made explicit what the song meant to her beyond what her obvious emotion revealed. The power of quote, _27_ came partly from its ambiguity, from the way it suggested more than it stated, leaving listeners to fill in the gaps with their own experiences of loss and memory and longing. The ruins where Jenny danced could be any ruins, could represent any lost glory or faded dream. The ghosts she danced with could be personal ghosts, the memories of dead loved ones that haunt all of us in one way or another. The song was specific in its details about Jenny and Oldstones, but it was universal in its themes, touching on experiences and emotions that transcended the particular story it told. Different singers performed quote, _28_ in different styles, some emphasizing the melancholy and the tragedy, others finding a kind of beauty in the sadness, still others performing it with a lighter touch that acknowledged the sorrow but didn't dwell in it too heavily. The best performances seemed to balance all these elements, honouring the sadness of the song while also celebrating the beauty of memory and the persistence of love even after death and loss. A poorly performed Jenny of Oldstones could become maudlin or boring, the sadness overwhelming the music until listeners simply felt depressed rather than moved. But a well-performed version could be transcendent, could create moments of genuine emotional connection between performer and audience that justified all the difficulties and dangers of the performer's life. Religious music in Westeros served different purposes than secular songs, though the line between the two was not always clear or absolute. Quote 30 was the primary hymn of the faith, sung in septs throughout the southern kingdoms, celebrating the 7 aspects of the one God and invoking their blessings and guidance. The lyrics praised the Father for justice, the mother for mercy, the warrior for courage, the smith for strength, the maiden for innocence, the crone for wisdom, and the stranger for the acceptance of death. The song was ancient, its origins lost in the depths of time, and it had been sung by countless generations of faithful worshippers in countless septs across the millennia since the Andals brought the faith to Westeros. Quote, 31 was meant to be sung communally, by congregations rather than by solo performers, and its melody was designed to be accessible to common people who had no musical training, simple enough that anyone could sing along. This communal aspect was important to its religious function, creating a sense of unity and shared devotion among those who sang it together, making them feel part of something larger than themselves, connected to each other, and to all the other congregations singing the same song in other septs across the realm and across the centuries. But there were also more complex religious compositions, pieces that required trained singers to perform, that showcased the musical sophistication of the faith's traditions. The High Septon's coronation was accompanied by elaborate choral works that could take years to master, performed by choirs trained specifically for this purpose. Wedding ceremonies in the faith used special songs that blessed the union and invoked the Seven's protection over the married couple. Funeral rites included dirges and lamentations that helped mourners process their grief through music, giving form and structure to emotions that might otherwise be overwhelming. The relationship between religious music and secular music was complicated by questions of appropriateness and propriety. Some septons felt that music should be reserved for worship, that using one's voice or musical talents for secular entertainment was frivolous at best and sacrilegious at worst, a waste of gifts that should be devoted to glorifying the divine. Other septons took a more relaxed view, seeing no conflict between performing religious music in sacred contexts and secular music in other settings, recognizing that music served multiple human needs and that all of these needs were legitimate. In the north, where the old gods were still worshipped, there was less formal religious music in the way that the faith understood it. The worship of the old gods was quieter, more personal, conducted in godswoods before heart trees rather than in structured congregational settings. But the northerners still had songs that touched on religious themes. Old ballads about the age of heroes and the legendary figures who served the old gods, tales of Brandon the Builder and the Night's King and Jaraman and the others who populated northern mythology. These songs were not exactly hymns, were not performed as part of worship in the way that the Song of the Seven was, but they served similar functions of connecting people to their spiritual traditions and to the deep history of their culture. Children's songs and nursery rhymes formed another category of music that persisted across time and that served important cultural functions despite their apparent simplicity. These were the songs that mothers taught to their children, that children sang to each other while playing, that carried on from generation to generation with a resilience that more complex music sometimes lacked. The simplicity of children's songs made them easy to remember and pass on. The familiar melodies and rhythmic patterns sticky in a way that more sophisticated compositions sometimes were not. But children's songs often carried hidden depths, meanings that children might not understand but that adult listeners recognized and appreciated. Old nursery rhymes about kings and battles and political events were sung by children who had no idea what they were singing about. The historical references obscured by time and by the transformation of the songs through countless retellings. A rhyme that had once been a biting political commentary on some long-dead monarch had become just a silly song about a man who fell off a wall or a group of people who danced around in a circle, the original meaning lost but the song itself persisting. Lullabies were perhaps the most intimate of all songs, performed in private moments between mothers and children. Fathers and daughters, nurses and the babies they cared for. These songs were soft and gentle, designed to soothe and calm, to help children drift into sleep. The lyrics were often simple and repetitive, the melodies uncomplicated, the whole thing optimized for its specific purpose of facilitating rest and providing comfort. But lullabies also carried emotional weight far beyond their simple construction, becoming associated with early childhood and safety and love. Triggers for powerful feelings of nostalgia and connection that could persist throughout a person's entire life. The oral tradition meant that songs changed as they were passed from singer to singer, from generation to generation, with no authoritative version that could be referred to as the original or correct form. A singer learned a song from whoever taught it to them, and that teacher had learned it from their own teacher, and so on back through time, and at each transmission small changes might occur, words misheard or deliberately altered, verses dropped or added, melodies adjusted to fit the singer's range or style. These changes accumulated until a song might exist in dozens or hundreds of variations, all recognisably the same song in some fundamental way, but different in their details, their emphasis, their particular character. This variability was not a flaw of the oral tradition, but one of its strengths, allowing songs to adapt to changing circumstances and tastes, to remain relevant and meaningful across centuries of social and cultural transformation. A song that remained fixed in an ancient form might become incomprehensible or boring as language and customs changed, might lose its connection to contemporary audiences and fade into obscurity. But a song that could change, that could incorporate new elements and drop outdated ones, that could be reshaped by each generation to fit their particular needs and sensibilities, such a song could persist indefinitely, could remain alive and meaningful rather than becoming a museum piece or a historical curiosity. The tension between preservation and innovation, between maintaining traditional forms and allowing creative reinterpretation, was constant in Westerosi musical culture, as in all oral traditions. Some singers prided themselves on performing songs exactly as they had learned them, preserving what they believed to be authentic versions passed down through their families or their communities. Other singers felt free to innovate, to add their own verses or to combine elements from different songs or to transform traditional material in whatever ways seemed interesting or appropriate. Both approaches had value and both served important functions in keeping musical culture alive and responsive to changing circumstances. The phenomenon of songs outlasting the singers who performed them, outlasting even the composers who created them, speaks to something profound about the nature of art and memory and human connection. A singer's voice was temporary, lasting only as long as the singer lived and could perform. But the songs could persist for centuries, for millennia, carrying forward something of the vision and the emotion and the craft of their original creators, even when those creators had been forgotten and their names were unknown. The song became larger than any individual, became part of the collective cultural heritage, belonged to everyone and to no one, could be claimed by any singer willing to learn it, but owned by none. This persistence of song in the face of loss and change and the passage of time offered a kind of consolation, a suggestion that something of human creativity and human feeling could survive even when individual humans did not, that art was in some sense immortal, even though artists were not. A mother who sang a lullaby to her child might be singing the same melody that her own mother had sung to her, and her mother's mother before that, going back through generations until the chain of transmission disappeared into the unknown past. In singing that lullaby, she connected to all those previous singers, participated in something larger than her individual life, passed forward to her child something that had been passed to her, contributing to a continuity that transcended individual mortality. While we have been examining the great songs that persisted across generations and regions, the famous pieces that nearly everyone knew and that appear in the historical record because they were significant enough to be noted and remembered, we should perhaps turn our attention now to the far larger number of singers and performances that were never recorded, that left no trace beyond the momentary pleasure or distraction they provided, that were performed by people whose names we will never know, and who probably never expected to be remembered. These were the common entertainers, the ordinary people who sang not as professionals seeking fame or fortune, but simply as part of the daily texture of life, who made music in the margins and the backgrounds of the grand historical narratives we have been exploring. The innkeeper's daughter, who sang for her father's customers, occupied a position that was simultaneously public and private, performing for strangers but within the safety of her family's establishment. She was not a professional singer in the sense that a wandering minstrel was, did not depend solely on music for her livelihood, didn't travel from place to place seeking audiences. But she performed nonetheless, standing in the common room while travellers ate their meals and drank their ale, her voice providing atmosphere and entertainment that made the inn more pleasant and more memorable, that might encourage customers to stay longer and spend more freely. That contributed to the establishment's reputation as a good place to stop. We might imagine such a young woman, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, helping her mother serve food during the day, and then singing in the evenings when the common room filled with travellers, her repertoire consisting of the traditional songs that everyone knew and expected, the familiar melodies that created a sense of comfort and normalcy, even for those far from home. She would know _quote _ 33 _ and several other bawdy tavern songs, would know love ballads and seasonal songs and perhaps a few local pieces specific to her region. Her voice might be genuinely lovely, or it might be merely adequate, pleasant enough but not remarkable, and in some ways this ordinariness was part of its appeal, made her seem approachable and authentic rather than distant and professional. For her, singing was work, but not only work, was performance, but also genuine expression. It was something she did because it was expected and useful, but also perhaps because she enjoyed it, because she liked the attention and the applause, because it gave her an identity beyond just being the innkeeper's daughter who served meals and cleaned chambers. The travellers who heard her might remember her voice fondly when they thought back on their journey, might associate her songs with warmth and rest after long days on the road, might even tell others about the pleasant inn with the daughter who sang so sweetly. Or they might forget her entirely within days of leaving, her performance blending into all the other performances they had heard at other inns, her voice indistinguishable in memory from countless other voices. The relationship between such a singer and her audience was different from the relationship a professional performer had with those who paid to hear them. She was not distant and exotic, but familiar and local, not someone passing through, but someone rooted in place, part of the community and the establishment rather than separate from it. This familiarity could be an advantage, creating a sense of intimacy and connection that professional performers might struggle to achieve. But it could also be a limitation, making her seem less special, less worthy of full attention, just part of the background noise of the tavern rather than someone to actively listen to and appreciate. In the kitchens and washhouses of great castles and humble cottages alike, women sang while they worked, their songs providing rhythm for repetitive tasks and making the hours pass more quickly. The washerwoman scrubbing clothes in cold water, her hands raw and her back aching, might sing old ballads or working songs whose rhythm matched the rhythm of her scrubbing, the rise and fall of the melody coordinating with the physical motions of her labour. These songs were not performances in any conventional sense, were not intended for audiences beyond perhaps the other women working alongside her, but they were still music, still served important functions of making difficult work more bearable and creating social bonds between those who laboured together. The working songs often had simple, repetitive structures that reflected the simple, repetitive nature of the work itself, verses that could go on as long as the task required, refrains that everyone could join in on even if they didn't know all the words. The specific lyrics might be traditional or might be improvised, adapting old songs to current circumstances, adding verses about today's weather or last night's feast or the lady of the castle who was particularly demanding or kind. This improvisation was a kind of creativity, a way of making the songs personal and immediate rather than just reciting ancient formulas, though the results were ephemeral, forgotten as soon as the work was done, and the day moved on to other concerns. The community created by working songs was particularly important for women, whose labour was often isolated and undervalued, whose contributions to the household economy were essential but rarely acknowledged or celebrated. Singing together while washing or spinning or preparing food created solidarity and connection, made the women feel part of something larger than just their individual tasks, gave them a space to express themselves and to support each other. The songs might be cheerful or melancholy, might celebrate the work or complain about it, might be bawdy or proper depending on who was present and what the circumstances allowed. But they were always communal, always about sharing experience rather than performing for others. In the military camps that dotted the landscape during the War of the Five Kings, soldiers sang around their fires at night, their songs serving multiple purposes simultaneously. The songs built camaraderie and morale, helped men feel connected to their fellows and to the cause they were fighting for, or at least helped them feel less alone in their fear and uncertainty. The songs also provided distraction from thoughts of tomorrow's battle, from awareness of mortality, and the likelihood that some of those singing tonight would be dead within days or weeks. And the songs connected soldiers to home, to the lives they had left behind and hoped to return to memories of peace and normalcy that seemed increasingly distant and dreamlike as the war dragged on. Soldiers' songs were often bawdy and irreverent, full of crude humour about bodily functions and sexual encounters and the stupidity of officers, humour that served as a release valve for tensions and frustrations that had no other acceptable outlet. A soldier could not complain directly about his commanders, or about the futility of the campaign, or about his fear, but he could sing songs that expressed these feelings indirectly, wrapped in jokes and exaggeration, and the license that music provided to say things that would be insubordination if spoken plainly. The songs were also often violent, celebrating martial prowess and describing battles in terms that glorified combat, rather than acknowledging its horror, creating narratives of heroism and glory that made the soldiers feel like they were part of something meaningful rather than just pawns in political conflicts they barely understood. The marching songs served a different function, providing rhythm and coordination for large groups of men moving together, turning the march from individual suffering into collective action. The best marching songs had strong, steady beats that matched the pace of walking, refrains that everyone could shout together, verses simple enough to remember even when exhausted and footsore. These songs made the miles pass more quickly, or at least made them feel less endless, gave men something to focus on besides their aching feet and empty bellies and the weight of their equipment. In the septs where the faithful gathered to worship, the septons and septors led their congregations in hymns and prayers, their voices ideally strong and clear enough to be heard throughout the seven-sided chamber, setting the tone and the pace that the congregation would follow. Some septons had beautiful singing voices and took genuine pride in their musical leadership, saw their ability to inspire devotion through song as an important part of their calling. Others sang adequately or poorly, but did so because it was required, because worship in the faith included communal singing, and someone had to lead it. And if their voices were not lovely, at least they were sincere. At least they demonstrated devotion and effort, even if the results were not aesthetically impressive. The congregation's participation in the singing was uneven. Some voices strong and confident, others wavering and uncertain. Some people enthusiastically belting out the familiar hymns while others mumbled along or simply listened without singing. But the overall effect was meant to be one of unity and shared devotion, all these individual voices blending together into something larger than any one of them, creating a sound that filled the sept and rose toward the ceiling and hopefully toward the seven themselves. The music was not meant to be perfect or professional, but communal and sincere, an offering of voices rather than a performance to be evaluated and judged. The street performers in King's Landing and Old Town and Lannisport and the other great cities of Westeros competed for space and attention in crowded marketplaces and squares, their performances often brief and hurried, trying to capture the attention of passers-by who were focused on shopping or business, or simply getting from one place to another. A juggler might set up his pitch at a busy intersection, beginning his routine and calling out to attract a crowd, hoping that enough people would stop to watch and that some of them would throw coins when he passed his hat. An acrobat might perform flips and handstands, her physical prowess on display for anyone who cared to watch, her income dependent entirely on the generosity of strangers who owed her nothing and might walk past without even looking. The competition for audiences was fierce and sometimes cutthroat, performers jockeying for the best locations, trying to draw crowds away from rivals, occasionally coming into conflict over territory or perceived theft of material or simple personality clashes. A singer who had claimed a particular corner as his regular pitch might arrive one day to find another performer already set up there, and the resulting argument could become heated or even violent. Resolved through negotiation or intimidation, or appeals to whatever authority might be willing to intervene. The City Watch generally did not care much about disputes between street performers unless they disrupted commerce or became actually dangerous. So performers had to sort out these conflicts themselves, or simply accept losses and move to less desirable locations. The puppet shows and mystery plays that appeared at festivals and tourneys represented a more organised form of street performance, groups of entertainers working together to present narratives and spectacles that required coordination and rehearsal. The puppeteers manipulated their carved wooden figures through scenes from legend and history, making the puppets fight and love and die while speaking their lines in voices that were often comically exaggerated, turning tragedy into entertainment and making the ancient stories accessible and immediate for audiences that might include children and adults, commoners and occasionally nobles who wandered through the festival grounds. The mystery plays enacted religious stories or moral tales, performers taking on roles of saints and sinners, gods and demons, enacting the eternal struggle between good and evil in performances that were both devotional and entertaining. These plays were sanctioned, or at least tolerated by the faith, seen as serving educational and spiritual purposes, even though they were also clearly designed to amuse and draw crowds. The quality varied enormously depending on the skill and dedication of the performers, some mystery plays achieving genuine power and beauty, while others were crude and barely comprehensible. The performers rushing through their lines and their movements in order to finish quickly and move on to the next performance, or the next town. Children performing for the first time, whether in organised groups or simply singing for their families, experienced music in ways that were fresh and immediate, uncomplicated by the self-consciousness and the performance anxiety that older performers often developed. A child singing a nursery rhyme or a simple folk song might do so with complete unself-consciousness, focused entirely on the joy of making sound and saying words, not worried about whether the performance was good or whether anyone was listening or judging. This innocence and authenticity could be charming and moving in ways that more polished performances sometimes were not. The child's genuine pleasure in singing coming through clearly, and creating connection with listeners who remembered their own early experiences with music. But children also learned through performance, gradually internalizing the social rules and expectations that surrounded music, learning which songs were appropriate in which contexts, discovering how audiences responded to different kinds of performances, beginning to develop the skills and the awareness that would allow them to perform more effectively as they grew older. A child who sang for visiting relatives might notice which songs made people smile or clap, might pay attention to when people seemed bored or distracted, might begin to adapt their performance based on these observations, taking the first steps toward becoming a skilled performer, even if they never pursued music professionally. The old performers who could no longer perform represented a particular kind of loss, and a particular kind of transition. Singers whose voices had faded with age, acrobats whose bodies had become too stiff and painful to execute the movements they had once done so easily, jugglers whose eyesight or coordination had deteriorated until they could no longer keep the objects in the air. For those who had built their identities around performance, who had spent their entire lives as singers or fools or jongleurs, the loss of ability to perform was devastating, a kind of death even while they still lived, the ending of the life they had known and the self they had been. Some old performers adapted by finding new roles, teaching younger performers the skills they could no longer execute themselves, becoming coaches and mentors who passed on knowledge and technique to the next generation. This could be satisfying in its own way, offering a sense of continuity and contribution, even if it lacked the immediate gratification and the public recognition that performing had provided. A singer who could no longer hit the high notes or sustain long phrases might still be able to teach younger singers how to breathe properly, how to support their voices, how to interpret lyrics and connect emotionally with material. An acrobat whose joints could no longer handle the stress of tumbling might teach children how to stretch and strengthen their bodies, how to fall safely, how to build the skills that would allow them to perform when they were older. Other old performers simply retired from performance and found entirely different work, carrying with them the memories of their performing years, but no longer defining themselves primarily as entertainers. A former juggler might become a shopkeeper, selling the kinds of goods that travellers needed. His days of performing at fairs and festivals remembered with fondness or bitterness, or complicated mixtures of both. A former singer might settle down and marry, raising children and working at ordinary labour, her voice now used only for lullabies and for singing along with others at festivals or religious ceremonies, no longer the centre of attention but part of the community in new and perhaps more stable ways. The community aspect of music, the fact that almost everyone participated in some way even if they were not professional performers, meant that music was genuinely democratic in ways that many other art forms were not. A person did not need to be able to read to sing, did not need expensive materials or tools, did not need access to rare knowledge or specialised training beyond what could be picked up through listening and imitation. Anyone with a voice could sing, and most people did, in contexts ranging from highly formal to completely casual, in settings public and private, alone and in groups, for audiences and for themselves. This universal participation in music meant that the line between performer and audience was fluid and permeable, that the same person might be a performer in one context and part of the audience in another, that roles shifted depending on circumstances and needs rather than being fixed and permanent. The mother singing a lullaby to her child was a performer in that moment, even if she had never performed publicly and never would. The soldier singing around the campfire was both performer and audience, his voice part of the collective sound, but also just one voice among many. The congregation member singing hymns in the sept was participating in performance, even if individual voices were not distinguished or highlighted, contributing to the communal act of worship through song. This democracy of music meant that loss of professional performers, tragic as it might be for the individuals involved, did not mean the end of music in any community or region. The songs persisted because they belonged to everyone, because anyone could sing them, because the knowledge of how to perform was widely distributed rather than concentrated in a few specialists. A village that lost its most talented singer might mourn that loss and might miss the quality of performance that the singer had provided, but the villagers would still sing, still pass songs on to their children, still gather together on special occasions to make music communally, even if no individual performance was particularly impressive. And yet, we should also acknowledge that this widespread participation, this democracy of music, existed alongside and in tension with the reality that some people were much better at music than others, that talent and training did create meaningful differences in the quality of performance, that there was genuine value in the skills that professional performers developed through years of practice and dedication. The fact that everyone could sing did not mean that everyone sang equally well, did not make professional performers unnecessary or unimportant, did not eliminate the distinction between amateur participation and skilled performance. The relationship between professional and amateur music was complementary rather than competitive, both serving important functions and both drawing from the same fundamental human impulse to make sound and rhythm and melody, to express emotion and tell stories and create beauty through organised noise. The professional performers kept alive the most complex and demanding pieces, pushed the boundaries of what music could do and be, created innovations and excellence that raised standards and inspired others. The amateur participants kept music rooted in daily life, ensured its transmission across generations, made it accessible and immediate rather than distant and specialized, reminded everyone that music belonged to all rather than to a privileged few. As we have drifted through this landscape of common entertainers and everyday music, through the unnamed singers and the casual performers and the people who sang simply because singing was part of being human, we might reflect on how much of musical culture existed below the level of what gets recorded in histories or remembered in grand narratives. For every Symon Silver-Tongue whose name we know and whose fate we can trace, there were thousands of singers whose names are lost, whose voices are silent, who existed and performed and brought beauty or at least distraction into the world, and then died and were forgotten. For every great song that persisted across centuries, there were countless other songs that were sung a few times and then abandoned, that never caught on or that served temporary purposes and then were no longer needed. This vast ocean of lost performance and forgotten music represents not failure, but the natural ecology of cultural production, the reality that not everything can or should be preserved. That much of what humans make is meant to be temporary, to serve immediate needs and then to fade, to create moments of connection or pleasure or meaning that exist fully only in the moment of their creation, and then are gone. The unnamed singers and the lost songs are not less valuable for being forgotten, were not less meaningful to those who experienced them at the time, contributed just as much to the texture of life and to the preservation of musical culture as the famous pieces and the celebrated performers, just in ways that leave less obvious traces for later historians to find and catalogue. As we have been contemplating the vast ocean of unnamed performers and forgotten music, the everyday singers whose voices filled the background of Westerosi life without leaving clear traces in the historical record, we might now turn our attention to a larger question, perhaps the largest question of all when considering the lives and works of those who sang. What remains when the singer is gone? What legacy does a life of performance leave behind, if any? What survives the individual voice, the particular person who once stood in a tavern or a great hall and opened their mouth and made sound that moved through the air and touched the ears and hearts of those who listened? The most obvious answer is that the songs survive, that the music outlasts the musician, that a well-crafted piece can persist for centuries or even millennia after its composer has died and been forgotten. We have already discussed this phenomenon to some extent, examining how songs like The Bear and The Maiden Fair and Jenny of Oldstones continued across generations, adapting and changing but maintaining some essential core of identity that made them recognisable and meaningful to listeners separated by vast spans of time. But perhaps we should explore more deeply what this survival actually means, what it says about the relationship between art and mortality, between individual creativity and collective memory. The Jesters of the Citadel, those scholars who devoted themselves to the preservation and organisation of knowledge, had an ambivalent and complicated relationship with music and with those who made it. On one hand, the Jesters recognised that songs preserved history and cultural memory, that they contained information about past events and ancient customs that might otherwise be lost, that they served important social and educational functions that complemented the written records the Jesters maintained. Some Jesters took genuine interest in music, collecting songs and attempting to write them down, trying to create archival records that would preserve what the oral tradition might lose. Samuel Tarley, the Mester in training we encounter in the histories, was particularly interested in old songs and the stories they told, seeing them as windows into the distant past, as sources of information about the Age of Heroes and the Long Night, and the other legendary periods that the Jesters studied. Sam understood that songs might contain kernels of historical truth wrapped in layers of myth and exaggeration, that the emotional and symbolic content of songs could reveal things about how people understood and processed their experiences, even when the literal details were unreliable. He sought out singers and listened to their performances with scholarly attention, trying to learn what he could from the musical traditions that paralleled and sometimes contradicted the written chronicles he also studied. But other masters were more sceptical or even dismissive of songs and singers, seeing them as unreliable sources at best and as active distortions of truth at worst. These maesters pointed out that songs changed in transmission, that performers altered details to make stories more dramatic or more pleasing to current audiences, that the need to create rhyme and meter often forced changes to facts that destroyed historical accuracy. They argued that written records, while not perfect, were at least stable, that a chronicle written down would say the same thing every time it was read, while a song might be different every time it was performed, the variations accumulating until the current version bore little resemblance to what the original composer had created. The practical result was that much music was preserved only through the oral tradition, with all its strengths and weaknesses, while the maesters focused their preservation efforts primarily on texts and written knowledge. This meant that songs that happened to catch the interest of a maester might be written down and preserved in the citadel's libraries, available for later scholars to study and perhaps to revive if the oral tradition failed. But most songs were never written down, existed only in the memories and the voices of those who sang them. Would be lost forever when those singers died and were not replaced by others who knew the same material. One aspect of musical preservation that often went unnoticed was that songs travelled farther and faster than written messages in many circumstances, particularly among common people who could not read and who had no access to the ravens and the written correspondence that nobles and maesters used to communicate across distances. A wandering singer could carry news from one end of the realm to the other more effectively than official messengers in some ways, because the singer's news came wrapped in music and story rather than in dry factual reporting, because it was entertaining rather than just informative, because it could be passed along by anyone who heard it rather than requiring literacy in official channels. This power to shape collective memory and understanding was significant, even though it was often unrecognised by those who wielded it. Most singers were not deliberately trying to create propaganda or to manipulate public opinion in service of political agendas, though some certainly were employed for exactly those purposes. Most were simply performing songs that they had learned or composed, making choices about material and interpretation based on what they thought would please their audiences or what they personally felt about the events in question. But the cumulative effect of thousands of individual performances and choices was to create a kind of folk history, a common understanding of the past that existed alongside and sometimes in tension with the official histories maintained by maesters and the narratives promoted by those in power. The theme of survival through art, the idea that there is a kind of immortality in creation that transcends physical survival, appeared repeatedly in the stories of the singers we have examined. Symon Silvertongue died terribly, his body destroyed and consumed, his life ended by the very ambition that had driven him to compose a song about Tyrion and Shay. But the fact of that song, the fact that he had been a composer as well as a performer, the fact that he had created something new rather than just reproducing traditional material, these facts survived in the historical record even though the song itself was apparently never performed and was lost when Symon died. His ambition doomed him, but it also ensured that he would be remembered, that his name would appear in the histories as a cautionary example, that future singers would learn his story and perhaps draw lessons from it about the dangers of blackmailing the powerful. Hot Pie survived in an entirely different way, by recognising his limitations and choosing safety over adventure, by setting down his journey with Arya and Gendry, and finding a place where he could live and work without constant danger. His survival was physical and immediate rather than artistic and symbolic. It was about continuing to draw breath and to eat and to sleep and to wake up the next morning, rather than about leaving any lasting legacy or making any mark on history. And yet Hot Pie's choice to survive through transformation, to become a baker rather than continuing as a fugitive or a traveller, was its own kind of wisdom and its own kind of creation. The direwolf bread he made with such pride was not a song, but it was made with the same spirit, the same desire to create something meaningful, to take pride in one's work, to connect with others through the things one made. Both forms of survival were valid, both had their place and their value. The world needed people like Symon who pushed boundaries and took risks and created new things even when doing so was dangerous, who were willing to gamble everything for the chance to make their mark and to be remembered. But the world also needed people like Hot Pie who knew when to stop pushing, when to accept limitations, when to choose life and safety over glory and recognition. The tragedy was not that different people made different choices, but that the cost of those choices were often so high that survival of any kind required so much struggle and sacrifice that both creation and simple existence were achievements rather than assumptions in a world as harsh and unforgiving as Westeros during the War of the Five Kings. The idea that we remember songs longer than we remember most kings is provocative and worth contemplating as we approach the end of our exploration. The kings of the Seven Kingdoms before Aegon's conquest were largely forgotten by common people within a few generations of their deaths, their names preserved in the chronicles that maesters maintained but not in the living memory of the population. The Storm Kings and the Kings of Winter and the Kings of the Reach had ruled for thousands of years, had commanded vast armies and built great castles, and made decisions that affected millions of lives. And yet most of them were unknown to the people who lived in the territories they had once ruled, remembered only as a vague succession of ancient monarchs, whose individual personalities and achievements had been lost to time. But the songs from those same periods persisted, were still sung and still known, still part of the active cultural life of the realm rather than relegated to dusty archives. A farmer in the Reach who could not name a single king of the Reach, from before the conquest, might still know, quote, 36 and a dozen other songs that were equally old or older. A soldier in the Stormlands who had no idea who the Storm Kings had been might sing marching songs that had been sung by armies thousands of years before. The melodies and the basic structures of the songs persisting even as the specific words changed to reflect new circumstances and new conflicts. This persistence of song where political power faded suggested something about what matters in the long run, about what survives the immediate concerns of politics and war, and the rise and fall of dynasties. Power is temporary, is always being contested and transferred and transformed, and even the greatest kings eventually die and are forgotten by all but specialists and scholars. But art, when it connects with something fundamental in human experience, when it touches on emotions and situations that transcend particular times and places, can persist indefinitely, can remain meaningful and vital across centuries and millennia, because it speaks to things that do not change even when everything else does. The singers who created and transmitted this art were mostly forgotten as individuals, their names lost even when their song survived. But perhaps this anonymity was appropriate rather than tragic. The songs belonged to everyone who sang them and to everyone who listened, were part of the common heritage rather than the possession of any individual. A singer who composed a song that entered the general repertoire had given something to the culture that would outlive them, had contributed to the collective artistic wealth in ways that benefited countless people they would never meet. The lack of individual recognition for this contribution was a kind of loss, certainly, but it was also a kind of liberation. A recognition that art could be valuable without needing to glorify its creator, could serve human needs without requiring that anyone remember who first made it. As we prepare to conclude our long exploration of singers and songs in Westeros, we might reflect on what we have learned or remembered or discovered in this journey through taverns and courts, through peace and war, through the lives of those who sang and those who listened. We have seen that music serves many purposes: entertainment and preservation and propaganda and comfort, that it can be weapon and salve, that it carries both truth and lies, that it connects us to each other and to the past while also existing fully in the immediate present of performance. We have seen that those who make music occupy complicated positions in society, simultaneously valued and marginalized, given license to speak truths that others cannot speak while also being vulnerable to violence and exploitation, creating beauty while struggling to survive, And perhaps most importantly, we have seen that even in the darkest times, even when everything seemed to be falling apart, people still sang, still found reasons and ways to make music, still reached for beauty and meaning and connection, despite all the forces arrayed against such reaching. The silent singers, those who died or who chose to stop performing, were real losses, represented talents and voices and perspectives that the world was poorer for losing. But the songs continued, carried forward by other voices, adapted to new circumstances, kept alive through the stubborn human refusal to let the darkness extinguish all light and all sound and all possibility of joy. We have travelled together through the lives of those who sang and those who stopped singing, through the courts and the common rooms, through the moments of beauty and the moments of silence. We have seen how songs outlasted the singers who first gave them voice, how music persisted even when everything else was falling apart, how the smallest voices could carry meaning that echoed long after they were silenced. From Hot Pie's simple direwolf bread to Simon Silvertongue's fatal mistake, from Tom Sevenstreams wandering the war-torn roads to Patchface singing his cryptic prophecies by the sea. We have witnessed survival in all its forms, resilience in all its guises. If you have found some peace in these stories, some comfort in knowing that even in the darkest times people still sang, still found ways to make beauty and meaning, then perhaps you can carry that knowledge with you into sleep. The songs continue even now somewhere in that imagined world, drifting through taverns and great halls, sung by voices we will never hear but that exist nonetheless in the space between history and dream. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day fall away like a cloak set aside. Let the songs drift through your mind, gentle and distant, carrying you toward rest. And now your watch has ended. Sleep well, friend. The night is long, but morning always comes.